Hey everyone, I'm Ben, and in this video, I'll give you the most comprehensive Make.com course on the internet. I'll cover from beginning to end everything you actually need to know for building and selling automations on Make.com. From the foundations to all the important built-in modules, AI integration, and more advanced features like APIs, HTTP requests, scraping, text parsing, and formulas, and I'll make it all practical by giving you plenty of examples. If you don't know me yet, I'm Ben. I run an AI automation agency since 2023, and I've built and delivered hundreds of Make.com automations for clients by now. And this video is a breakdown of everything I know. And by the end of this video, you should understand everything you need to know to start building or selling automations on Make.com. Now, before starting, very quickly, what are we going to cover? As I said, we're going to cover everything from beginner to advanced. And basically, you're going to learn everything you need to know to build any automation on Make.com. Now, if you have a little bit of experience with Make.com, you already know some things. You can also use the chapters below to go to the section that's most interesting to you. So what are we going to cover? First, I'm going to give you a quick overview of Make.com, why use it, the key concepts, and a little bit of an overview of the UI. Then I'll cover data types. Now, this is where most non-technical people get scared. And you don't actually need it to understand this 100% to actually start building on Make.com. But in my opinion, it is extremely important to actually understand how these data types and structures actually work. Because first of all, everything you're going to do in Make.com will make so much more sense if you understand these data structures. Second of all, debugging, which is a part of building AI automations or automations in general, will become 10 times easier because most errors and problems you'll face are usually related to data types and data structures. And thirdly, it really is not rocket science. So please stick with me for that one if you're not familiar with it yet, because I think it's going to help you a lot in the long run, and you learn it once and you'll know it forever. Then thirdly, I'll go over all the essential modules and skills you need to know in Make.com. Triggers, webhook, filters, routers, connections, HTTP requests, iterators, aggregators, tools, and error handlers. Then I'll go over AI integration, right? How do you actually integrate AI into these workflows, right? How do you set up these AI modules? How do you prompt them? The types of LLMs to use, the prompting frameworks to use, how to use prompt chaining, and use cases for AI integration into these workflow automations. And lastly, I'll go over some advanced features which you might need in more complex automations like functions, text parsers, regex, and some more. And then lastly, I'll build a lead generation automation from scratch, which I think can give you a good idea on how to approach building your own automations. And I'll give plenty of examples while explaining all of these concepts. So what is Make.com? Make.com is a no-code automation platform which we can use to automate tasks and workflows across thousands of different softwares. Now, this has existed for quite a while already, but now that we have AI, these softwares became 10 to 100 times more powerful, because with AI we can automate more complex processes and do lots more advanced automation. For example, a traditionally common used automation before the AI era was like a lead filled out a lead form and it automatically updates into your CRM. But now that we have AI, we can do lots more complex things with that data, right? For example, we can first research the lead, then we can let an AI or an LLM module actually qualify the lead, and we can add in all the enriched data into the CRM and actually already have pre-qualified the lead. Now, Make.com has a really easy drag and drop interface and lots of these modules built in to easily work with different data types and different data structures. Now, why do we use Make.com? Of course, again, to automate tasks and workflows across thousands of different softwares. Make.com has lots of native integrations with most popular softwares, making it a lot easier for us to connect to different softwares without custom APIs. Now, we can use that, of course, to automate lots of business processes to make businesses more efficient. And now that AI has put automation on steroids, automation is really going to be one of the fundamental pillars for businesses in the upcoming years to stay competitive and efficient in the marketplace. And therefore, people who provide these services to companies have lots of opportunities to make money. Right. Some examples of automations we use in our business, for example, are automating newsletters, social media content generation, inbound lead qualification, personalized outbound email campaigns, but we do lots more. And in today's age with AI, you can really automate almost any process or workflow you can think of. Now, very quickly, before diving into Make.com, how does Make.com compare to other no-code automation softwares? Zapier is probably the most famous one, and N8N is getting a lot of traction too at the moment. And basically the way we can see it here is on the left side with Zapier, it's generally the easiest to use platform. And on the right side, we have the more technical platform with N8N. Now, Make.com sort of lies in the middle. Now, it's important to note that usually the easier to use a platform is, the less customization and flexibility we'll have in the long run or for more complex workflows. And second of all, they're usually more costly, right, or pricey, right? While the technical ones, we have more customization and flexibility for complex workflows, and generally they're cheaper to run, right? Make.com lies in the middle, but I'd say lies a little bit more towards N8N side, especially in terms of price and customization. So my general recommendation for non-technical people starting with automation is Make.com, because it's very easy to use, but we're not limited by flexibility. We can still do very custom and complex workflow automation. And it's also very cheap to run compared to a platform like Zapier. Now, N8N could be another option, but N8N might have a little bit of a steeper learning curve when you're just starting out, as it is a bit more technical, right? You can see also that Make.com has more than 2,000 native integrations, which basically allow us to connect to softwares with one click instead of setting up custom APIs, which can be a little bit trickier when you're just starting out, right? So this really helps a lot in making it easy. So some key concepts or terminology you need to know in Make.com is, first of all, scenarios. Scenarios are just the name Make.com gives for one workflow or one automation system, right? Then we have modules, which is one step of the scenario, right? And a module can be an API, a software, a data transformation module. It's just one of the modules in a scenario. Then we have connections, which is connections with softwares, right? Then we have webhooks and triggers. And webhooks and triggers are the only two ways to activate or trigger an automation or a workflow. And then we have operations. And operations is basically one run of one module, right? And it's important to understand that terminology because we get charged based on operations in Make.com. So let me dive into Make.com and give you a little bit of an overview of Make.com. So first of all, here we have Make.com. You can sign up for a free account here. Now, it's pretty straightforward to sign up, so I'm not going to bore you too much going through that process. Really easy. Once you've logged in, you'll come to a screen like this, where you have your dashboard overview. Now, I'll not go over everything because, first of all, 95% you'll never use. And second of all, I want to keep this practical. So really show you the actual important settings and features here in Make.com. So first of all, here we have the dashboard, right, where we get an overview of the operations we've run this month. Now, in these tabs, the only really important ones and the ones that you're going to use is maybe users, where you can invite other members to your team, right? Pretty straightforward. You can just invite a new one through email. Then we have the subscription, which is the paid plan. Now you can start for free, right? And you can have 2 active scenarios completely for free, right? Now it's perfectly fine to start with and to try this out, but the limitations of the free plan are that we can only have 2 active scenarios, 2 active automations. We have a 5-minute scenario execution time, which can become a limitation very, very quickly because as soon as an automation runs for longer than 5 minutes, it will run into an error. Right, and we only have a 5 MB file size, right? These are the 3 main limitations of the free plan. So as soon as you're going to take this a little bit more serious and start automating multiple projects or more complex workflows, you need to go to the paid plan. Now, I recommend you go straight for the pro plan because with the pro plan, you basically have 0 limitations anymore, right? You can do anything inside of the pro plan. Now, I have it on 20,000 operations, but if you're just starting, you could probably go for the 10,000. Which means it's $18 a month, and you can do quite a lot. As you can see here, we don't really have limitations because in the core plan, we still have a 40-minute scenario execution time. So if you have a workflow that runs for longer than 40 minutes, it will time out and give you an error. We only have 100 MB file size, which usually should be enough. But with the pro plan, you don't have any of these limitations. So I recommend going for this one if you're seriously going to build out automations. For the team plan, I haven't really found a good use case for the team plan, as you can also invite members on the pro plan. So that's it for the plans. Then here on the sidebar, again, you're not going to really use any of these except for scenarios, right? Because these others I can walk you through very quickly. The templates is basically a sort of a template library for Make.com. I can tell you they're very simple, the templates, and in practice, they're not very usable. Then we have connections, where we basically have a list of all the softwares we've integrated, but we can do that inside of the scenarios, right? And we have webhooks, and we have some more options. But again, you're never going to spend any time here, right? Or rarely. So let me dive into the scenarios where you're going to spend most of the time, because here we're actually building our automations, right? As you can see, I have all my automations listed here. These are my active ones. And here below, you can see I have the non-active ones. Now, I'm very disorganized, as you can see, but you can organize this a bit better in folders, which is probably recommendable to do if you have this many automations. Now, here we can create a new scenario, but what I want to do first is show you an automation that I use. And through that automation example, I will go through all the important data types and structures, which again are important to understand, and all the important modules you should know in make.com. So let me show you an example of an automation that I use. We can check the YouTube competitor tracker. Now, as you can see here, we have lots of different modules. Now, what this automation does, basically checks on a daily basis some YouTube channels active in the AI space to see if they have uploaded new videos. And if they have, we extract summaries from the transcripts and extract some other data points like views, etc., and output it back into my database. Now, in this case, I use Airtable. So as you can see here in my Airtable, I have the channel URLs that I want to track, right? And it outputs it back into that Airtable. So I get a nice summary. So I'm going to run this in a second so you get a better idea. But very quickly, if you're new to the make.com interface, right, as you can see, we have the modules here. We have lots of different modules here. That's why I think it's a good example. And I'm going to go through all of these modules in detail and all the other important modules later. But first, I want to just give you a quick overview of the settings here. So as you can see, this on the left side, the Airtable, which is the search records module, has one more circle, which is the trigger, right? And as you can see here, we have the scheduling trigger. So this automation runs every day at 9 a.m., right? Now here at the bottom, we have the menu bar, right? And on the left side, this button you're going to use quite a lot, which is the run once, where we can basically activate the automation manually. And you're going to use this a lot to test out your automations, right? Then here we have another option to define the trigger, right? Then we have a save button here to save the workflow when you're building. This one you're not really going to use in practice. Then we have some settings here. Now in the settings, you're not really going to touch this when you're building on make.com, except for this one, the allow storing of incomplete executions. Now this one we need to activate when we are going to work with error handlers, which is very important when we deliver this to clients, etc. And when we run these automations at scale, this is important, but I'll get to that, the error handlers, later in this video. Then here we have notes. So you can add some notes to the workflow. I never use it, to be honest. And then we have here previous versions, so you can undo your last actions. Then we have the auto align. So let's say I'm building and I'm being messy. Make.com has a feature where we can auto align, right? And here in the three buttons, this one you won't really use, the explain flow. These two are important. For example, I'm gonna give you this automation if you wanna have it. So I can just click here on export blueprint. And basically what it will do is it will export a JSON. As you can see, a JSON, right? And if you now want to import this automation or this flow into your make.com, you can just in your make.com click on import blueprint, right? You choose that JSON file and you'll have the whole automation workflow pasted into your make.com account. So that's it. Here we have just the modules, which again, I'll go over later in this video, but that's it really for the settings, right? So quite easy. So let me just run it and walk you through very quickly. So if I run it, as you can see, first here, it's extracting all the YouTube channels I want to track, right? Then we have the RSS feed, which again, I'm going to explain all of this in more detail later, but this basically checks if they've uploaded new videos. And if they did, we extract the video URL. Now this text parser will take the video ID, which we need in this module, which is an HTTP request, which is basically a custom API call, which scrapes the YouTube transcript of the video, right? Now these two modules basically transform the data we got from the YouTube transcript into a format that we then pass into the OpenAI module, which basically makes a summary of the YouTube transcript, and then we output it back into Airtable together with some other data points like views, etc. So if we go back into Airtable, if I go into the YouTube content tracker, you can see we got new video summaries, right, of some competitors, right? So that's how it works in practice. So Now, before I go into details and explain you all of these modules and how they work and all of the other important modules to know in make.com, I do want to go over the data types and the data structures. Again, not the most exciting topic, but really, really useful. And it's going to help you so much understanding everything else we're doing in make.com if you understand the data types and the data structures. And it's also going to help you debug so much faster. So stick with me for 10 minutes because you learn this once and you'll know it forever. So why are data types and data structures important to understand? It's because when we're automating workflows like this, we're basically passing data from one module or API or software to another module, right? And each of these modules expects data to be structured in a specific way to be able to receive the data, right? And then outputs data in a specific structure too. So it's really important to understand what a specific module, what type of data a specific module expects, right? And the fortunate thing is make.com makes that really easy for us. Instead of showing us raw data or us having to put in raw data, they have an interface to make it really easy for us to understand. So for example, if we have this RSS feature, right, which basically checks YouTube channels to check if they have uploaded new videos, we can see here we have the input fields, right? So what does this module expect the data to be put in? So here we have the URL, which is the URL of the YouTube video in this case. And we have a date, and you can see here the type it expects is a date. So we know that we have to fill in a date format, right? We have a date too, where we can basically filter, right? I'm going to go through all of these in more detail later, but let's stick to input fields for now. And then lastly, we have a maximum number of returned results, and you can see type is number. So here we can only put in a number. We cannot put in text, etc. So make.com makes this really easy for us to understand what these modules expect. Now, this one, for example, is a little bit more complicated, right? We need an array, right? Which I'm going to, again, explain in a second. But make.com just shows us very easily what data it expects right now. Now, the second nice thing in make.com is here in these bubbles, we basically can see the result, right, of this module running, right? So the output of this module. And again, make.com shows this in an easy to read way, right? We don't have to look at raw data. We can sort of look at it in a way simpler way. So we can see here the input data, what did it receive? And here we have the output data, right? And instead of seeing raw data, we have this sort of expandable little thing. So we can see we get all the data back. We get a URL from a video, the date created, the author, and then we get some other data points here, right? Now, in the raw data, this actually looks very different. So if I go here and download output bundles, this is the actual raw data of that, right? Which is a lot more complex. That being said, sometimes we have to transform data in order to be able to pass it on to the next module, because the data structure we get from this output, for example, is different than what the next module expects, right? It's structured in a different way than the next module expects. So for example, we have that in this part, and that's why we use some data transformation modules, which again, I'm going to explain in more detail later, right? But that's the second reason why it's really important. And the third reason is sometimes we have to filter data or we have to loop over data, right? Basically meaning, for example, in this one, we need this automation to run on 11 different YouTube channels, right? Which are in our database, right? We don't want to run it only on one, right? And sometimes we have to instruct the system to actually filter this out, separate it, and run it 11 times on each of these modules. And we can do that through iterators, which I'm going to explain in a second too. But it's important to understand data structures when you're going to work with iterators and aggregators and things like this. Now, again, nice thing, make.com has a lot of these iterators and etc. built in. For example, here it automatically detected that there were 11 YouTube channels. So you can see it automatically ran this 11 different times on each of the different YouTube channels. Now, don't worry if you don't understand this completely yet. I'm going to go over everything in more detail in this video. So that being said, this is why data and data structures are important to understand, and it's going to help you a lot in the long run. So what are the different data structures? I'll go back to the presentation quickly. So first, we have strings, right? And strings are really easy. It's basically just text, right? Strings of characters, for example, names, messages, but anything really that is text, right? And in the raw data, we can identify it through the double quotation marks, right? So an example could be New Age Digital, just the name of company, right? And in make.com, we can recognize it because it says text, right? It expects text, as you can see, right? So that's a string, really easy. Now, in the raw data, the way you can see that is through the quotation marks, right? Then we know it's a string. Then we have numbers, Now, numbers speak for themselves, numerical values like ages, budgets, etc. Now, the difference is in the raw data, it's without quotation marks, right? It's just a number, right? Now, again, we can identify this in make.com really easily because make.com just tells us right here, type number. So we can't put in a name or anything else, right? So the way you can see this in the raw data, for example, if we go in that same one, here we just get it presented in a nice way, so there are no quotation marks for strings, etc. But if we look at the raw data, we can see, for example, the URL is a string, right? And the max results is 5, right? We don't have the quotation marks. Now, then we have dates, which is just a specific input format that some APIs or modules expect, right? Then we know we have to put in a specific date format, which you can usually do like this, or if it has to be time specific, it's with an ISO formatted string, how they call it, which basically here says T, which is time, right? With the hours, minutes, and seconds, and even the time zone. Now, again, we can easily recognize this in make.com because it just says date, right? Same here, date. Right now in make.com is really easy. If we want, we can just go to the date section. And for example, if you want a date of now, we can just click it like this and make.com will automatically fill out today's date. Right, but if not, if you want to do a specific date, you have to type it into that specific format. Right now, then we have Booleans, which are basically true or false conditions, right? And in make.com, they present it through a checkbox. Again, making it really easy for us to do, right? So an example is true or false, right? So in make.com, you will see this, for example, as just a check mark. If we check this one, all the way at the end here, we have smart links, right? And we see yes or no, right? And we can just select it. But actually in the raw data, it will say true or false because that's how the software in this case expects the data to be received, right? So if we look at the raw data, we can see false, right? And without quotation marks because it's a Boolean, right? Then we have binary data, which are for files or audio. For example, if we want to pass in a document to Google Drive, then we would have to work with binary data. Now, we don't have that in this example of this automation, but again, make.com makes this really easy for us because as soon as a module expects a file or binary data, it will automatically appear inside of make.com as a check mark. It will automatically identify that one of the previous modules has binary data, and then you can just select it like this, right? So again, making it really easy for us. Now, this is still straightforward, I think. In the next part is where most non-technical people throw in the towel. So please stick with me because understanding this will help you a lot. And really, it's no rocket science. So the next one is an array, right? And an array you could basically just see as a list, right? A list of values, for example, right? An example could be a list of emails, right? So in make.com, you can recognize it by seeing an input field, for example, domains in this case, and you have different items and you have this extra button with add item. Right? So we have 3 emails and you could basically see this as a spreadsheet with one column with a list of values, right? As you can see here. Now, the way this shows in raw data is through these square brackets, right? That's how you can identify that something is an array, right? So we have these square brackets, then we have the value, which in this case is a string. That's why we have the quotation marks. And they are separated, all the values are separated by commas, except for the last one where we don't need a comma. So basically, as soon as you see this, you know that something is an array, just a list. Now, why are they important? It's because lists store multiple values. So because, for example, in the example I showed, we have a list of YouTube channels, right? And we want to retrieve the entire list, right? So the way we get that back from Airtable is through an array, right? A list of all the YouTube channels, right? Now, the second, which you've probably already heard, is JSON, right? Which is also called an object, right? And in make.com, they call it a bundle, which I'm going to explain in a second. So a JSON, all it is a structured way to store and transfer data. And it's the most common way to send and retrieve data in modern APIs, right? Literally 99% plus of APIs use JSON, right? So it's really important to understand JSON, and it's really, again, not rocket science, right? So the way you can see it is basically, for example, multiple data points for one person or product. So instead of just a list of single values, single emails, we actually, it's a structured object with multiple data points on one person, right? So for example, we have email, name, and company, right? And the way that shows in the raw data is through the curly brackets, right? As soon as you see these curly brackets with, here we have the key and here we have the value, right? As soon as you see that, you know we are dealing with a JSON, right? And it's basically just to store structured data, right? A way to store structured data. That's all it is. And again, we separate the values through a comma, except for the last one. And again, we have the quotation marks here because these are strings. And you can basically see it like a spreadsheet with multiple columns, right? So we have the email, name, company, right? With the 3 values, right? So that's all JSON is. Now we're almost there. Stick with me. Then we have array of objects, which Make.com calls a collection. Now you already know what an array is, and you already know what an object is. So an array of objects is basically a list of JSONs, right? So in our example, in our previous example, we had a person with multiple data points. All an array of objects would be, in this case, is multiple persons with multiple data points, right? So as you can see here, we have that same JSON, but in this case, we also have the curly brackets because it's an array, and we have 2 different people's data points, right? And again, we separate that through a comma, and we end it with the square brackets. So we can see this is an array, this is a JSON, so it's multiple JSONs inside of an array, so it's an array of objects. And in Make.com, they also call that a collection. Now, this can also be 10 or hundreds of different objects, right? So very important to understand, this is a collection, right, in Make.com, and one single one would be a bundle, right? Now, lastly, you can think of this, of course, again, as a spreadsheet with multiple columns, right? So instead of just one, we have a list of multiple ones, right? And then we have the last one, really, which is nested objects, which is structured data inside of structured data, right? So, for example, in that same example, we have, right, name, Anna, email, and company. But inside of company, we have another few data points. So we have another JSON inside of the JSON, right? So it's structured data inside of the structured data, right? So, for example, the company name and the company industry, right? So we have a JSON here, right, for the company, and a JSON for the person. So it's a structured object inside of a structured object. Now, this can be combined. These arrays and objects can be combined. But once you understand arrays and objects, or JSONs and lists, right, you understand all these data structures, right? Because sometimes you'll see things like this, right? You have an array, right, with multiple objects, right? But inside of the object, we have another object. And inside of the nested object, we have another array, another list. Now, don't worry about actually having to make these objects and these things. You rarely ever have to write these yourselves, but it's really important to understand the structure. Really, if you understand arrays and JSONs, you're going to make your life a lot easier as making automations, right? So knowing this, let me show you an example. So if we go back here to the automation, right? So as you can see here, right, in this first module where we search records, where we basically retrieve all the records, right, you can see that here again, we get Make.com's sort of nice little way to see what we get back. So you can see here we get multiple bundles, right? So we get the 11 bundles. Now you know what a bundle is, right? A bundle is basically a JSON, right? So each of the bundles is basically one of the records, right, or rows in Airtable, right? And each of these bundles, of course, have multiple data points, right? The channel URL, the videos, the subscribers, the channel ID, and you'll see this in here. If we open the bundle, we can see we have the channel ID, we have the YouTube, the channel subs, the subscribers, the videos, etc. And you can see inside of this, we have an array, right? So we have multiple data points inside of this. Now, if we look at the raw data here, we can see that it's an array, right? Which a very long array, which stores all these different records in JSONs. As you can see, this is one record, one row, right? And we basically get the list of all these rows. Now, Make.com automatically identifies, right, that these are different rows, right? So they automatically put it into a bundle here. Now, why is that important? Because in Make.com, if Make.com presents this like a bundle, so all these 11 different bundles, if we pass in a specific value to the next module, Make automatically identifies and gonna run this automation on each of the different bundles. Make.com makes it really easy for us, because instead of us having to separate all these little objects, etc., we can just pass on a variable. It automatically identified that that variable is available in all 11 bundles, and it will run this module on all the different bundles. And as you can see, it did it 11 times. And that's why we see these 11 different operations, because it basically ran 11 different times on 11 different values. Now, this is all going to make a lot more sense when we're actually going to build. And I'm going to get practical in just a second. But the key takeaways is understand the different data structures, especially understand what arrays and JSONs or objects are. Understand that bundles, which are JSONs, right, are processed separately in make.com. Now, knowing that, everything else we're going to do and build is going to be a lot more straightforward and simpler to understand. So let's get a bit more practical and dive into the modules. So let me dive back into the presentation. So now I'll go over all the essential modules and skills that you need to know to build essentially any automation on make.com. Right, so I've covered all the important ones here. So we'll go over native APIs or connections, how they call them in make.com, variables, triggers and webhooks, filters and routers, custom APIs or HTTP requests, scraping, which in practice, for any automation, for most automation solution, you'll usually need some type of scraping, either web scraping or social media scraping, etc. So it's very useful to understand this. Then we go over iterators and aggregators, some other built-in tools in make.com that are practical to know, and lastly, error handlers. Then after this section, we'll go into everything related to AI. And lastly, at the end, I'll cover some more advanced skills to know in make.com that become useful when you're building some more complex automation solutions. So let me dive back into make.com and explain these three, right? Native APIs, variables, and triggers and webhooks. So if I'm back in make.com, right, and here I'm in the dashboard, let's say we're going to create a new automation now. All I do here is click on create a new scenario. And what you'll see here is make.com automatically opens this, which is basically all the different softwares make.com is natively integrated with. Right, you can literally find thousands of softwares in here, and most of the most popular ones are here. And all this is basically make.com has set up a connection with these third-party softwares already for us. So we don't have to set up custom API calls to these softwares, making it a lot easier for us. Now, the second thing make.com has done is basically has listed already the most common API calls or actions we want to take inside of these softwares already for us. So let's say we have Google Sheets here. We already have all of these actions, most common actions we actually want to take for building automations. They have already listed it out here, right? So you can see update a row, bulk add rows, search rows, etc. Right? Cells. Now, how do we connect these? It's usually either through an API key, let's say with Airtable. If we select search records, for example, if you don't have a connection yet, it will ask you to add a connection. Right now, let's say for Airtable, we need to do it through an Airtable token or an API key normally, right? You can usually just find these inside of the software settings, right? And you select those, you add those tokens in, and then it's the connection is set up. And the nice thing is that connection is set up forever, right? So as soon as you use a new action inside of Airtable, you already have that connection set up. Now, for example, with Google products, it's even easier. All we have to do is log in. Some other softwares also have that. So let's say we have the Google Sheets. We want to add a row. All you have to do here is sign in with Google. Right, you have to give them the permissions here that they can do anything. And then you have it set up, right? So very straightforward. Now, let's say, which doesn't happen a lot, but let's say you have an action that you want to take on these softwares that is not yet listed here, right? So let's say I want to archive a record, right? And it's not listed here, but it is actually an action that is available inside of Airtable's API. Then you usually find another option here at the bottom, which is called Other, and it says Make an API call. And if you click this, you see you actually need the endpoint, the URL, and we have to set up the specific action or API call we want to take on Airtable ourselves. So you can go to the Airtable documentation and set this up yourself. I'm going to explain later too how you set up custom APIs. But the nice thing, at least with this, is we already have the connection set up. right? So we don't have to add in API keys in this custom API request. But if you don't find a specific action you want to take, then it might be worth checking the documentation if that specific action is actually available in the API, because then you could set it up through this module, this action, make an API call, right? So the next thing we have to understand are triggers, right? And basically what you'll see if you open one of these softwares here, right? Let's say Airtable, the most common triggers are usually listed here at the top, right? So the most common used sort of actions for the first step or the trigger are usually listed here above. So we have watch records here, returns all newly created or updated records, or watch responses, triggers when a new response is submitted, or search records, search for specific records, right? And you have the same in Google Sheets, right? Watch new rows is at the top. Then we have, for example, here in cells, watch changes, sheets, perform a function. And you'll see that some of these, for example, this one is only available at this first step module. So if we, for example, have it in the second, right, you'll see that that one doesn't appear anymore, right? Because it can only be used as a trigger, right? Now, there are two important things to understand with triggers is we basically have two types of triggers, right? We have polling triggers and we have instant triggers. Now, what's the difference? Instant triggers basically does what it says it does. It instantly triggers as soon as something happens in that software, right? So it automatically triggers the workflow or the automation as soon as something happens, and only if something happens in that other software. And polling triggers are different because it doesn't instantly get triggered as soon as something is done. It basically polls the API or the software to check for update in a specific time interval. So let's say every 15 minutes, it will poll the API or the software to check if there are changes, right? And it's very important to understand the difference between these two, because you might assume that, for example, this one, watch records, is instantly triggered as soon as, let's say here, watch records returns all newly created or updated records. So you might assume that this one is instantly triggered as soon as a new record is created, but it's not. And how can you recognize it in make.com? It's simply because of this tag here, instant, right? So you can see watch records doesn't have a tag instant. So we know this is not an instant trigger. This is a polling trigger, right? So if I click this one, for example, watch records, right? So this is the nice thing of these connections, right? The connection already identifies all my databases inside of my Airtable. So let's say we have the Ben AI competitor watch table, right? We can select the table right away. Then we have the trigger field, which is just will be used to sort the records, right? So it's only created add. And let's say we go with channel name. And here we can define the limit, the amount of records we want to return. So in this case, we're only doing 11. And these are optional fields, which we don't really need right now. So as you can see here, this is, we have a clock here. And this basically tells us right away that this is a polling trigger, right? This is not going to be instantly triggered. We have to define the time interval in which we want the trigger to poll for new updates, right? So if I click on save, you can see it asks me choose where to start, right? So I can go from now on. So any changes from now on will basically be returned, right? Or we can choose all, or we can choose from a specific date in the past or in the future, or we can choose manually. So let's say we do from now on, right? And here, if we click on here, we can define the time interval where how often we want to poll the API or the software to check for updates or changes, right? So we can go with regular intervals, for example, every 5 minutes or every 1 minute, etc. Now, this is important to understand, right? It's every time we run this, even though there were no updates in my Airtable or in my records, it will still run every minute, right? And if you remember operations, right, we are charged to operations, right? And every time we run this, even though it doesn't return any results or there's no newly created row or updated row, we'll still be running one operation per time, right? So you have to take that into account when you make these automations, right? Now, you can do every 15 minutes, etc. Now, in our example, we did every morning at 9 a.m., which is perfectly fine. But for some automations, you, of course, want to run this a lot more, right? So let's say every day at 9 a.m., right? So here it asks you to activate the scenario. I have to save it first, right? And now it basically polls the API or Airtable every day at 9 a.m. to check if there are new records or updated records, right? And it will it will output back those specific records. Now, how do we test this? We can test these workflows 2 times. So we can either do this, run once, and you can see it basically returned nothing. Now, why did it return nothing? Because, of course, between the time that I said from now on, there were no updated or new records, right? So there are basically no results, but of course I can try and change it. So for example, here I can go choose where to start. So let's say I just click all just to test it here. You can click run once, or you can click run this module only, which is useful when you have multiple modules and you don't want to run the entire thing for testing. You only want to run a specific one. So if I click on run once, now you can see we get all the 11 bundles back, which are the 11 rows or records, right, with all the information. Now, let's say we want an automation to happen instantly when something specific happens in another software, right? So with Airtable, specifically, we only have one option, as you can see here. We only have this one as an instant trigger, which is watch responses. Triggers when a new response is submitted. And this is basically for a specific feature, I think, in Airtable, which is Airtable Forms. And you can see we only have this option for instant, right? So, and the second thing you can see here is for all the instant ones, we'll need webhooks. Now, what are webhooks? Webhooks are basically a way where we can receive data from third-party software as soon as a specific action happens in that other software, right? So if I click here, for example, on add, and I create a webhook, you can see we get a webhook URL here from make.com, which we can then give to that third-party software, in this case, Airtable, to basically tell Airtable, send relevant information to this webhook as soon as something happens inside of Airtable. Now, for this specific feature, I think the Airtable forms, I've never worked with it, but I can imagine when you're creating a form, you probably have an option there to add in a webhook, right? So you can just copy and paste that, and then as soon as a form is filled out, the data will be sent to this module. Now, in general, you can see we're pretty limited with the amount of instant triggers we get, right? We can only do this one with Airtable, for example. With Google Sheets, we only have watch changes in cells and perform a function. But you will see that we're pretty limited. Let's say my CRM, right? We only have watch entries. We're pretty limited. So let's say I want this automation to be triggered instantly when something happens in my Airtable dashboard. So for example, I want something instant to happen when this check mark is checked, right? So how do I do that in make.com? So that's where we can work with custom webhooks, right? Which is a built-in module in make.com, which you can find here or by just typing it in. And basically, we can create a custom webhook inside of make.com, which we can then use inside of these other softwares to let them know that as soon as something happens there, please send over data to my make.com scenario, right? So here you can go with custom webhook, right? And it works basically the same way. You can see if I click on add here and I, for example, call it Airtable webhook, and I click save, again, we get that URL. Right now, every software will have a different way, and sometimes there is not even a way, but usually you can figure out a way to connect this webhook to that software to make sure to instruct that software to send data to this webhook. So again, that's all this webhook does, right? It instantly receives data as soon as something happens, and only if something happens, which makes it more efficient, of course, because it only runs when something specific happens. We don't have to poll every 2-3 minutes, be charged operations when something doesn't happen. Right now I'm going to show you how to do this in Airtable because I do it a lot. But I'll show you one more example. Another example I commonly use a webhook for example, is my meeting transcript. So what I try to do with my meeting transcript is as soon as I finish a meeting, I want the webhook to be triggered to get my transcript, and then I can do things with it, right? I can update my CRM with sales call information, or I can try to write social media content based on my transcript through AI, etc. Right? So in this case, I work with Fireflies, right? Now you'll see that Fireflies has a native integration here with make.com, but they don't have any triggers and not any instant triggers. So I created this webhook here. What I can do is copy that webhook. And in Fireflies, it's quite simple. If I go to Fireflies, if I go to settings, you see here at the bottom that they actually give me an option for a webhook, right? And some of these apps will have that available, and we can just copy and paste it in, right? And you can see receive real-time notifications with webhook events, right? Transcription completed, and then we can add in that webhook, right? And as soon as a transcript then is completed, this make.com will be triggered and the transcript will be sent there, right? So that is how webhooks work. So let's say in my example again, in Airtable, we're going to set that up, right? So as soon as this is checked, we want to retrieve the record, right? So how do we do this specifically in Airtable? Now you can skip this if you don't really work with Airtable, but might still be useful. So what we can do is we can set up an automation here. So I'll just delete this one because I already had an automation set up. But basically what we can do here is add a trigger. Now in this case, when a record matches a condition, of course, when the checkbox is marked. So we can just configure it here. Table. Now the sheet is channel. The condition, of course, is when monitor is checked. And then we have to add in specifically here in Airtable a script, right? Run script. Now, this is going to require a little bit of code, right? I'm going to add this piece of code in the free resources in my free community too. If you want to know how to do this specifically with Airtable, here we have the webhook URL, right? All you'd have to do is copy that script and put in your webhook URL here. And of course, define your specific trigger, right? So let's say I go back here to make.com. I didn't create the webhook yet. I guess I didn't click on save. So I'll just generate a new one. So here we have it. Copy the address. I go back to the Airtable. I add it in there. Right now, here we have to define what we want to send over to the webhook in make.com. Now we want to send over the record information. Right, so we can just go Airtable record ID. I made a small mistake here. I need capital I because that's how I defined it here in the script. And then basically what I can do here in make.com is run once. And basically you can see the webhook now. It's basically waiting for information to be received. Right, so if we go back to Airtable, we can now click test. Right, and if we go back to, we can see that it ran. Right, you can see it received data, and the data it received is the record ID, right, which I defined right here. Now we can't send over more information, but I'm going to show you why I only sent the record ID, because now we know the automation is immediately triggered as soon as I click that checkbox, right? And what I can do now is go to the Airtable and say get a record, right? And here I can just simply add in that same base again. There we go. And you will see that it asks me here for the record ID, which now I can use. I got from that webhook and I can use in here. And these are variables, right? Which I haven't gone over yet. And I think it makes intuitively a lot of sense. But these variables, all these variables do is they store data, right? And of course, these are variable because every time this webhook runs, it will be a different row and a different ID, etc. So all we define here, we can just click it here. So as soon as we open this, we see this pop up. We can define the record ID. We can click on save, and that's it. So for example, we can try it again now, right? So we, again, can click run once to test it. We click here on test. And if we go back here, you can see it received it. It passed over that specific ID to the get a record, and you'll see in the output now, we get that bundle of that specific row back, right, with all the information. Now, one more thing I want to explain is webhook responses. And you can see here, if I click on webhooks, now we get another option here, which is webhook response. And through a webhook response, we can basically make sort of an API call out of this make.com scenario. So we can actually send information back, in this case, to Airtable. Now, this might not be the best example because we don't really need to send information back. But I, for example, use this a lot with Relevance AI, for example, where I try to make an agent that can use a make.com scenario and can actually send information back, right? So for example, a common one I use, I'll show you very quickly, is, for example, Relevance AI is if you don't know Relevance AI, don't worry, but is an AI agent builder, right? And what Relevance AI misses is, for example, Google Docs integration. Now, make.com has a Google Docs integration. So what I do is I just make an API call from Relevance AI. I add in that webhook. I send over the text that I want to add into a Google Docs. I've added that information, as you can see, title and report, into the Google Docs module here in make.com. So this creates a Google Doc, and then I use a webhook response to send that information back to Relevance AI, so my agent can actually use the link of the doc, right? And that's what this webhook response serves for. As you can see here, you can define which variable, what data you want to send back, right? And as soon as you add a webhook response, basically what will happen is the software will wait for a response to get back. So you don't always need it. If you don't need information back to the software, you won't need it. But for example, for this relevance AI agent, usually you want the agent to receive information back. Then these webhook responses can be very useful. Now, if this does make sense, make sure to check out one of my relevance AI tutorials, and I think you get the idea very quick. So let me get back to my presentation. So we've covered these. Again, if you want to look at all of this in detail, I'll make sure to put the presentation in my free community. So if you want to check it out, make sure to check the description below. I'll put a link to the free community. So that brings us to filters and routers, which you're in practice going to use quite a lot when you're building automation systems. Now, filters speak for themselves, right? Basically, are conditional checks to let bundles through or not, right? For example, only process status is approved. Now, routers split workflows into multiple paths, each with their own logic or actions or workflows, right? Use cases, of course, can be to sort incoming data, filter data, or create parallel workflows for different data types or records in this case. So if I go back to my initial make.com automation, for example, let's say we want to add in a filter. We can say something like, we only want to process videos with over 10,000 views, let's say. So what we can do is add a filter. Now, I already know that we get the amount of views from the RSS module, right? That's the data that the RSS module brings back, right? So, for example, you can see it here, right, in the output. I think it's here in the RSS field. Sometimes you have to look for these specific values, and it takes a little bit to find them. But you can see, I think it's here, media statistics. Here we have the views, right? So what we do is basically we don't want to put the filter all the way at the end, right? Because otherwise we're processing all of these videos, or all these modules will cost an operation if we're actually not going to update the Airtable. So we want to put it as close to the data point. So in this case, we can put it in here, right? And as you can see, we have these little lines, and then we have this little icon here, and that's basically where we can add in filters, right? So in this case, I'm going to put it here. Click on that, and there you have set up filter. Now the label is just to name it, so we can say 1,000 or 10,000 views, right? And here we can set up the condition. Now here, of course, we have to add in the variable from the RSS module, right, with the view count. So again, we look that up, which is going to be here, media statistics. Now, when you do this, always important to do this, to select the right value here, right? Because if we select properties, it's not going to work. We have to select this one, views, right? And then here we can define the condition, right? So you have lots of options here available. Now, in this case, it's a number, so we have to go with numeric operator. So we go with greater than, and then we add 10,000. Right, and now you can see the icon changed here to a little filter, funnel, and now we have the filter applied. So if we run the same automation again, we can see this one now produced 3 results. Let's see if there's any filtered out right now. So you can see now they were filtered. These were filtered out, right? So only one was actually more than 10,000 views, right? So that's how filters work. Pretty straightforward, I think. Now for routers, let's say in this example, we want to have a video that has over 20,000 views. We want to, besides just updating our Airtable, we want to notify us through Slack, just as an example. So what we can do is separate this one. For example, we can click here on link, and then we're going to add in a router, right? Because one workflow has to only update the Airtable, and the other workflow has to notify me through Slack. So what I do here is I can either select here the router, or I can go here into the toolbar, and then in the flow control settings, you'll also find the router, right? These are common modules you're gonna use, right? So here we add in the router, right? And then we can define as many paths as we want, really, right? Now, in this case, we only need 2. You can see it automatically connects. And in this case, we also want to notify us through Slack. Right, so we just add in Slack. Slack's already connected with me, so we can go with create a message. Here we select the channel, right? So let's just send it to general, right? And then maybe what we can send over is the YouTube URL. right? So we just select that variable, in this case from the Airtable, right? And then we click save. Right, now for the other route, we can just clone this, right? Which is a useful feature too, right? Just cloning, right? And you can see it automatically attached. And we can do different routes. So let's say we want one for when it has more than 10,000 views, one for when it has less than 10,000, one when it has more than 20,000. I don't know if this is the best example, but you get the idea. And you're going to use routers quite a lot. I'll show you an example of an automation we run with lots of routers in a second. Now you can see if we don't define a filter now in this router, it will pass it on to both, right? So in this case, we're going to add a filter here, which says, let's say 20,000 views. Right, we do the same thing. We go back to the RSS module, go to the view count. We select greater than, and in this case, 20,000. We click save. Now we have the filter applied. Now there's one more option here, which is the fallback route. Like let's say is a backup route that is used if the source data didn't go through any other route, right? So you can define this. You don't have to. Let's say it doesn't match any of the filters. If we put another filter here, then we can define a fallback route if it doesn't match any of those, right? So that's it. Now in this case, let's say we can put in a completely different workflow here, right? Now in this case, we keep it simple. Probably we could have done this only with a filter, but you get the idea. Right, now let's try this again. And you can see it didn't have 10,000 views. As you can see, 20,000 views. So it went this route, right? So those are routers. I can show you a quick example of one that we have with many routers. For example, our inbound leads. So you can see we have multiple routes here, depending on the type of inbound lead we get in, and we have another router inside of a router here, etc. So you're going to use these quite a lot in practice. Let me get back. Now, the next thing we have to understand is really how to set up custom APIs, which we do through HTTP requests. Now, why is this important? When would you actually use this? Now, in practice, when you're working in make.com, you basically find three use cases where you actually need to work with custom APIs, right? The first one is when you want to add a software into your workflow or your automation that doesn't have a native integration with make.com yet. Now, because make.com has so many native integrations, and especially with all the popular softwares, for this use case, you don't come across it very often, right? Almost all of the softwares we use on a daily basis and you probably use in your automations will be available as a native integration in make.com, but sometimes you'll find that a specific software is not yet integrated. And then we have to work with custom APIs through HTTP requests. Now, again, I have done hundreds of automations, and I can probably count on one hand the times that the software was absolutely not integrated with make.com yet. Now, the second use case is when make.com actually has a native integration with the software, but doesn't have the specific action that you want to take on that software. So let's say a software in their API and documentation has lots of different types of actions we can take, but make.com has only listed maybe 10, and it doesn't list the one that we actually want to do. That's where we also have to start using and knowing how to set up custom APIs. Like the example I said before, right? Let's say we have Airtable, we do have a native integration, but let's say you can see it's pretty limited, the amount of things we can do here. Let's say we want to archive a record. I don't even know if that's actually possible, but just as an example, then we can use this make an API call here. And then you can see we still have to set it up ourselves, right? So we have to understand how custom APIs work. And then the third use case, which you come across most often in my experience, is for scraping. Now, when you're building these automation flows and workflows, etc., in practice, you're going to use a lot of scraping, right? Because a lot of times we're trying to get data from a specific place, transform that data to either generate content or maybe qualify leads, etc. But usually we have to get data from a website or from social media, etc. So scraping is a very common use case, and usually we need an HTTP request to get access to a scraper, right? Which we do through an API call. So very quickly, if you're new to APIs, I'm going to explain it very quickly. Literally in a few minutes, you'll understand how APIs work and you'll know it for the rest of your life. So don't be intimidated. It's actually really easy. So what are APIs? APIs are application programming interfaces, and they are what allow different softwares to share data and work together, right? So you can think of it like giving apps a structured way to talk to each other, right? Which they usually do through JSON, which you now know what it is, right? Now, there are 4 important points to understand in APIs, which is the first one is endpoints. And endpoints are basically like specific addresses where the API is accessed. And each endpoint usually represents a specific action that you want to take inside of the software, right? And these are usually just URLs, right? For example, right, if we want to create a HubSpot contact, right, in HubSpot, this would be the endpoint, right? And you can usually recognize the action we want to take here at the end, where we have contact in this case for HubSpot. Now, where do you find this? You can always find this specific information on the documentation pages of websites, right? So let's say my CRM is Atio, right? So if I just type in Atio documentation, right, you'll find all of this information in there, right? So in this case, I go to reference, and here you can see all the actions we can take with the Atio API, right? And you can see list objects, create an object, get an object, update an object, etc., right? And here inside, you can see we find the endpoint, right? So that's how we identify it. So those are endpoints. Then we have HTTP methods. Now, HTTP methods are basically used to define what kind of actions we're taking. So the most common ones are, which you almost always come across, which is first of all get, and get is usually used to retrieve data. In the HubSpot example, right, pulling a contact details, right, getting contact details. Then we have post is to create or send something. For example, creating a new HubSpot contact. Then we have put or patch, which are a little bit less common, but it's usually used or sometimes used to update existing data, like editing a contact detail. And then we have delete to remove data, right? So if we look at Atio, again, we can find this in the documentation pages, right? So you can see for every action here, we get the method, get post, get patch, get post, get patch, right? So very easy. Then we have headers, and headers basically carry some important data about the request. Usually it's like instructions for the API on how to process the request. The most common headers you have to include in your HTTP request are authorization. And this basically tells the API who you are and if you're actually authorized to make this call to the API, right? And you usually do that through an API key. And the second one is the content type, which is a very common header. You will almost always find this. And this specifies the specific format the data is being sent into the API call, right? It's almost always application JSON because almost all modern APIs work with JSON, right? So an example for HubSpot is bearer, and then you have to add in your API key. So this is very common, right, for the authorization. So this would be the header, and these two are the headers, and these are the values, right? Bearer, then you add in your API key, which again, you can usually find in the documentation page. And for the content type, it's application JSON. So again, if I go to Atio, we can go here to create an object and then here, usually you can find which headers you can see, right? In this case, it's accept application JSON, right? Authorization and the content type. So in this case, we need 3 headers, right? But that's the thing. You can usually find this information here on the side too, right? So we see the request is a post, the URL is this, and these are the headers we'd have to include. So that's it. And then lastly, it's the request body. And the request body contains the actual data we're going to send to the API, right, to the software. So for creating a contact in HubSpot, the body might look something like this, right? Properties. And as you can see, as you now know, this is just a JSON with structured data, right? So we want to create a contact with this email, right? This name and this last name. Now, again, we can usually find this request body in the API documentation pages, right? So if you go here on JSON, usually you can get an example, right? And here you see the structure they expected in. So in this case, if we want to create an object in Atio, right, we know we can also check here which ones are required. So these are required, these 3. And then of course we can add in all the domains or specific columns we want to update to. So that's all an API request is, right? So if I go back to the automation, you can see we have one custom API call, right? The HTTP request here, right? And this one, of course, extracts the video transcript, right, from the video. So this one gets the new videos and the amount of views. Right now, what this text parser does is basically from the video URL, which we get in this one, it extracts only the video ID, right, which is what we need to actually scrape the YouTube transcript, right? This text parser, I'm going to explain later in this video how text parsers work. But that's all you have to understand for now, right? You can see in the output, we get the video ID. Now, this HTTP request, how did I set it up? Basically, what I used is Rapid API. And Rapid API is basically an API marketplace with lots of pre-made APIs that are ready-made for us to use, right? And they have lots of social media scraping, web scraping, and all other kinds of scraping APIs available for us and make it really easy to scrape things. I'm going to explain scraping in more detail in the next section. So you can see API marketplace, so you can just sign up for free. Right, and you can see in this marketplace, right, we have lots of different scrapers available, right? Instagram scraper, Amazon data, Twitter, LinkedIn, Ahrefs, etc. Now, in this case, we used the YouTube video summarizer, this one. And now that you understand how to set up APIs, this will be really easy because you can see here we get all the information we need to set up our API. Right, so first we see that the request is get, because of course we're trying to get information from the API. Now here we have the URL, which is going to be our endpoint, right? So we can copy that. So let's say I'm going to set this up from scratch. All I do is set up here the HTTP request. Then you're almost always going to use a make a request option, right? And we're going to add in that URL. Now you can see in this URL, we actually have the video ID here. Right now, they already filled it out with a default one, but of course we want to change this for the specific video that we want to scrape, and that's going to change. So we want to add in that variable, and we got that variable from the text parser module. Right, so we can find it here, and we just add in that variable. So we scrape the right video. Right. So that's what we do here. The method, of course, is get, and here we can find the headers. Right. So we have two headers, as you can see. The first header is going to be this. And here you find a headers option, right? And here we can just add headers. So we have two headers. The first one has this name, and this is the value. Right, and the second one is this one, which is the API key, which is very common to add into the header, right? Now in this case, because we're using a GET request, we don't actually have to send data to the API. So we don't even need a request body, which I showed you before, right? Because sometimes when we use these scrapers, we don't actually have to send data. So we don't need a request body. Also, because we already added the variable of the specific video we want to scrape inside of the endpoint, inside of the URL here, right? So, but if you would have to add a request body, all you do here is click raw in the content type. Again, it's almost always going to be application JSON. And then here you can paste in the JSON, right, the request body. Now you're always going to select parse response, because basically make.com structures the output data for you if you click this on yes. So you can always click it on yes. So that's it. That's how we set it up. And then we have set up the scraper. Quite simple, I think, especially if you understand custom APIs. So that's exactly what we did in this one. As you can see, exactly the same setup. And then we get the YouTube transcript back from that API. Right, that's it. So that's it for custom APIs. So if I go back, so let's go to the next section, which is scraping, right? I briefly touched upon scraping right now, but scraping is an extremely important and useful skill to know when you're building automations, because many of the automations you're going to build will use some type of scraping, right? Either it's web page scraping or social media scraping. You can get data from external sources or web pages, and you can, of course, do something with that data, right? Very common for example, lead qualification systems or outbound email systems or content systems. We want to get data from another place, do something with that data, and output it somewhere else. So very useful skill. And I basically divided it into 6 types of scraping, and I'm going to cover all of them, how you do all of them. But basically, if you know these 6 types, you can scrape 99% of the internet, right? So first I have simple page scraping. And what do I mean with simple page scraping? Simple page scraping is just the majority of web scraping, right? If we want to scrape a SaaS landing page, if we want to scrape a personal blog, any web page scraping is sort of simple page scraping. Then we have sitemap scraping, which with sitemap scraping, we basically get all the URLs from one domain, which sometimes becomes useful when specific information is maybe not available on the homepage, but on another page, we first have to find that other page before we can scrape it. Right, I'm going to give you an example later too, but it's very useful to know this. Then we have web crawling, right? And web crawling, what it does is it basically scrapes all the URLs, all the content of all the pages from all the URLs of the web page, right? So a common example for this at the moment, for example, is let's say I want to build an AI assistant or an AI agent that is trained on all the data from the make.com documentation, right? So it has that specific knowledge, so we can ask that assistant or that agent questions, and it has the specific knowledge on the make.com documentation. Then we can use, for example, a web crawler to crawl and scrape all the content from make.com's documentation pages, right? So that's what a web crawler does. And usually they take a bit longer, of course, because we're crawling lots of different pages. And we have social media scraping, of course, very common and very useful to know, right? You can scrape LinkedIn's, for example, to qualify leads or personalize emails. We can scrape Instagram to come up with new content ideas, or YouTube, what I showed in the example. But yes, this is very useful to know. And we have Google scraping, which is also going to be a very common use case when you're building automations, right? Scraping Google's results. For example, we only have someone's name and we want to find their LinkedIn to be able to scrape their LinkedIn. We can first use a Google scraper to scrape someone's LinkedIn. Then we pass it into a social media scraper to actually scrape their LinkedIn. Right. And then lastly, I have what I call complex page scraping. There's some types of websites that put anti-scraping methods in place, right? So they basically have some defenses to make scraping a little bit harder to do, right? And therefore I separated it, because usually we have to use different scraping methods to bypass those, right? And these methods we can't use. So for example, e-commerce is a very common use case where they have heavy protection in place, like Amazon or any e-commerce usually has pretty heavy protection. Then we also have some websites which are maybe login protected or have cookie pop-ups or CAPTCHAs, things like this. So for those types of websites, we can use different types of scrapers, which I'm also going to show you in a second. So let me start with simple page scraping, where we can basically, with these three methods, we can already scrape 90% of the internet, right? So the most straightforward and simple way to scrape a page is through an HTTP GET request. Now, I'm going to show you this. If I go back to make.com, and let's say we're going to do a new scenario. So let's say I want to just scrape my personal website, right, and make a summary. So all I do here is add an HTTP make a request, right, just as we did before with the API call. And we literally don't have to do anything here. We can just paste in the URL of the website we want to scrape, right? So let's say my website. Right, we just add in this URL, and what this HTTP request is going to do is going to make a request to the website and retrieve back the HTML, right? So I can click here on parse response, which we always do, right? Save, and if I run this now, you can see here in the data, in the output, we get back the scraped website, the scraped HTML. As you can see, there are a lot of HTML tags, right? So it's a very long format, right? Because we get a lot of these HTML tags, which of course is a bit messy. But now that we have AI, scraping has become so much easier, right? Because traditionally, when we were scraping and we wanted to extract a specific data point, right, it's pretty hard to program in exactly which part of the HTML to extract, etc. But now with AI, we can just pass this in, ask the AI what to extract, and the AI will do the rest, right? So it has become a lot more accessible to non-developers to be able to scrape, right? So let's say we want to make a summary on my website. So what all we would do first is we're actually going to clean it up a bit, because again, we get all these messy HTML tags, which we don't need. We only want the text, right? So again, make.com has some built-in modules. So we can go to the text parser, and I'm going to explain the text parser also in more detail, the other options later in this video. But we have one option here in the text parser, which is, again, a built-in module in make.com, which is called HTML to text, right? And you can see it converts HTML to formatted text, right? It's very useful for these scrapers. All we do is add in the variable with the data, with the HTML, right? And we can't finish a scenario with a text parser, so we're going to add in an OpenAI module right away to make a summary. Again, I'll go in more depth over the AI integrations also later in this video, but I'll show you a quick example. So let's say we're going to use GPT-4o, and we want to make a summary of the website. For example, we want to use that for a sales rep to have more information on a new incoming lead, right? So we can just add in the prompt here. We can go, please summarize what this company does based on the scraped website here below. And now, of course, we're going to add in that cleaned up, right, scraped website. We click save. Now we can run the scenario. And you can see now that here in this text, it already cleaned it up a bit, as you can see. Right, it's still a little bit messy, but it's a lot cleaner. As you can see, we don't have those messy HTML tags anymore. So we pass on a little bit cleaner data onto the OpenAI module, right, which of course saves us some cost too, right? Now you can see here we get the result. This company specializes in helping businesses implement AI-driven automation to scale their operations without hiring additional staff. Their services include AI strategy and roadmap design, AI-powered marketing and sales automation, and real-world AI implementation, high-volume operations. So pretty good. So that's it. That's the easiest way of scraping, right? It's a simple GET request. You can see how simple it is actually to do this, right, with AI now. Now, the thing with the GET request is it is the most straightforward and cheapest way to scrape, but it's also the one that's going to work less, right? As soon as a web page has some anti-scraping method in place, or even has JavaScript rendering, which some websites have, right? Which basically means that the code first has to load before the HTML shows up. And in that case, there's a delay between when the HTML shows up and then it will fail, right? Because this will request HTML right away, but it's not yet loaded. So this won't work for all websites, right? So if this doesn't work for a website, what you can try is another scraper, right? So the two other options you have for simple page scraping is, again, these marketplaces, right? Appify and Rapid API. So again, here in Appify, we can use this simple web scraper. It's good when you choose a scraper here to look at the amount of people using it and the ratings. Then you know that this is probably a good scraper, right? So this is a simple web scraper you could use. Or in Rapid API, we also have web scrapers available. Now, the third option, which is Firecrawl. Now, Firecrawl is a very popular scraper too at the moment, and for good reason. They're pretty good. So this is Firecrawl, right? They're pretty cheap too. So you can see we actually have 500 scrape credits. I think it's 1 credit per page scraped, and it's $0, right? And then we have for 3,000, we have $16 a month, right? And it's a pretty good scraper. So let me show you an example of Firecrawl, then I'll show you an example of Appify and Rapid API later. So let's say you've signed up here. Right here in the docs, you can see the types of scraping we have available here. We have actually crawling and mapping also available. For now, we're only going to scrape a page. You can see we can actually use batch scrape too, so we can scrape multiple websites at the same time. But in this case, we just want to scrape one. Now, again, we know how to do this, right? So we got all the information here. So if I go back to make.com, let's say we're going to add in a new scenario. Again, we just use HTTP make request. Now just paste all of this in so I don't have to go back and forth, but we can see the method is going to be post in this case. So it's always good to check it. The headers are here. Content type, application JSON. Right, and the second header here. Now this is common, right, where you have to add in bearer and then your API key. So if we go back to Firecrawl, I should have an account. Yes, it logged me in. So here you can find the API key. We copy that. And we add that here with a space after bearer, right? Then the request body we can find here, as you can see, right? This is the JSON. Right now, of course, we're going to delete this because we only want the endpoint here. And now we actually need a request body, right? So we're going to choose raw, application JSON, and here we can add in the request body. Now you can see we have the URL, which we can define, and the format. So in which format do we want to retrieve the results? Now, in this case, we don't necessarily need HTML, right? Because Markdown is a cleaner way of getting it back, right? So I can just delete this. Right, and in the URL, let's say you have a lead form or something, then of course you can add in the variable here too. Now in this case, I'm just gonna put in my website again. Wrong one, yeah. So if we run this, we get it back, right? So here we get the data, and you can see it's a lot cleaner than that GET request that we earlier did, right? Because we already got the markdown back. So it's already sort of a cleaned up HTML, basically. So that's another way to scrape, which you can try if it doesn't work on a specific website with a GET request. And you can also try always those scrapers on Rapid API or Appify. Now, let's go to the second scraping method, which is sitemap scraping, right? So let's say we have a lead form and we get the company homepage basically in there, but actually we're not that interested in it. We want to know what the team page is, for example, right? So we can extract more information from their team, who they are, what their roles are, etc. So then we can use a sitemap scraper. Now again, Firecrawl. Again, you can do this. Again, you have some sitemap scrapers available in Appify and Rapid API, but Firecrawl also has one, as we could see before. So here we have a sitemap scraper, right? And it's a very similar way. We can even, as you can add in a search, and response will be an ordered list from the most relevant to the least relevant. So let's say we want the team page, we can go with team, right? Or about us. So let me show you a quick example. So let's say I'm going to add one more here, make a request. Now in this case, the URL is going to be this one. You can see it changes here, right? To map. I'm pretty sure the headers are going to be the same. Usually they are. So I can just copy them from here because the headers are usually defined by the type of application. Then we have, of course, authorization, which we already put in the other one. And the body type, application JSON. Now we have to add in the request content, which again we can find here. So let's say we're going to add this search too. It's just going to sort, right? So it's still retrieving all the URLs from a specific domain, but it's just going to sort it for a specific one. So let's say I don't have a team page. So let's say blog. I want to find the blog of a website. We go parse response, and we're going to add in again my website, just as an example. So if we run this one now, so I made a mistake. It's because of get. It's actually post. So now it should work. And now we get it back. And now you can see we don't get the content or the HTML back, but we get all the URLs of my website, right? And now, of course, let's say we're looking for a specific page, we can add in an AI module, right, that finds that specific page. So for example, I could say something like, so I could say, let's say I want to find the blog or all the blog pages for my website, right? Because I could want to scrape them after this, right? So for example, I could say, look at the sitemap below, output all the blog pages, output all the blog pages, only output the URLs, right? We add in, in this case, we use the second one, the links, add it here at the bottom. We click on save, and if we run this again now, you can see this one outputted all the links, and now the OpenAI module is extracting all the blog links, which, for example, we can then pass on to a page scraper to actually get all the content from there. All right, so if we click on results, you can see it extracted all my blog. You see post, right? It identified the blog articles, right? So this can be very useful, right? If you're looking for specific information that might not always be available on the homepage, right? That's where we can use sitemap scrapers. Now for the third one is crawlers. Now I gave you the example already of, let's say, the make.com documentation. So we can take that as an example. Now again, we have Firecrawl, also has a crawling option, as you can see here. And again, you can also do this with a API file, right, for example. But I'm going to show you in a second how to set up a scraper with an API file. So you know how to do it with any scraper you want, right? But here you can see we also, actually here, we have a website content crawler. Right, but we're going to use Firecrawl again, right? So if we go to crawl here, you can see we get, this is the information we need. And you can see we can add in a limit. So the amount of pages you actually want to crawl to not overdo it, because you can imagine some websites have literally thousands of links. So if we're going to crawl every single page, it's going to be a lot of content. And then we can also have the scrape options again here, right? The format. Now let's try this one. So let's try with the make.com documentation page. I'm just going to add it here. Make a request. Again. So we're adding in the request body, again, application JSON. We add it, parse response. Now we still miss the API key. So I can just copy this. Right, and then we have to define, of course, here what we want to scrape. So let's say we want to make.com developer documentation. Right, now this is going to probably be quite a lot of pages here. So we want to get the URL here, which includes all the documentation pages. So let's say, okay, here, API documentation. So this should be the base URL, because then basically it's going to scrape every URL that has something attached here. So if I click here, yeah, you can see that it adds it here. So I'll take the base URL. All right, I add it in here. Let's say we do, just for now, a limit of 10. And we want to get both formats back. So we click save. Is there something missing? Yes, this, of course, we have to delete. So that was faster than expected. Let's see what happened. Okay, so it seems like, okay, I get it. So if we go back to the documentation, yes. So because this crawling can take, of course, really long if you're scraping hundreds of pages, the way this works is we actually have to, if you're using curl or async, this will return an ID where you can check, where you can use, what you can use to check the status of the crawl. Right, so use to check the status of a crawl job and gets it results. Right, so we'd have to use another API key here to actually check when it's ready and to actually get the results back. Right, so let me show you quickly. And that's a good opportunity to show you, for example, a wait module. So let's say this actually takes, 3 minutes. And we can add in a sleep module here, right, which we get into tools. And then we can wait before we check for the results, right? So let's say we want to check for the results, right? We set up another one. In this case, it's get, right? Because we're going to want to get the status. And you can see here in the URL, we need to add in the crawl ID, right? Which of course we get here, as you can see. Right, so that's it. And then the headers are the same. Again. We click save. Now let's see, I'm going to put in the delay a little shorter. But if we run this module now only, we can check. We just paste in the ID manually right now. Here we got the ID, just so you can see how this works, right? This basically, if we want to test it, but we need a variable, then we have to fill it out manually, right? can see if we get it back right now. Yes, you can see. Now we get all the data back from the document. You can see it's a lot of data. Now, let's say we want to make that assistant or that agent. We can then add this into a database or a vector database, right? For example, an OpenAI, right? And then we can give that vector database to an AI agent or an AI assistant. So it has that specific context and information on the make.com documentation page. So you can do that in here too. For example, add files to a vector store, right? Now, I'm not going to show that. I'm going to show the whole AI integration in more detail later in a later section. So that's it for crawling. Now we're almost there with scraping. The next one is, then we have social media scraping and Google scraping. Now both you're going to use quite a lot when you're building automations, right? I mentioned some examples before, but yeah, knowing how to do this is going to be very useful. Now, social media websites are very protected against scraping, right? They usually make it really hard for us to scrape. So these traditional scraping methods are not going to work for social media websites. But luckily, we have Appify and Rapid API, where people build APIs specifically to scrape all of the social medias, right? So if we go, for example, to the Appify, I already showed Rapid API, right? We have all the social media scrapers here, right? Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, not a TikTok. You have multiple scrapers usually per platform. We have Twitter, YouTube, etc. So, and for Google, the easiest way to scrape, and by the way, Google scraping is also very common, right? Sometimes you need to extract URLs from a Google search, for example, and in practice, you'll use the Google scraper quite a lot in many automations, right? So the best way to do that is through the Serper API. So I can show you quickly. Serper API, as you can see here, the world's fastest and cheapest Google search API, right? And we get 2,500 free queries. So you can just sign up for a free account. I already have an account, right? So let's say I want to build an automation, which includes both of these, just to show you very quickly. Let's say I have a hypothetical scenario. I have a lead form where inbound lead fill out their data. And let's say I only have access to, or they only fill out the name, right? But we want to actually do more research on that incoming lead to get some more data points, maybe know where they work, what their job title is, how big their company is, and then output all of that extra data into the CRM. We can even pre-qualify them so we get some more information in our CRM. So let's say we want something like this. I can show you very quickly how to build that in make.com. So let's say we can have the trigger with a lead form. Now I want to focus this on scraping. So I'll just pretend like we have a lead form as the first one, but I'll go for the scraping right away. So again, for the Google search, we're going to use an HTTP make a request module again, right? And we go to the Serper API. Again, this is free, right? Here we get the URL. We can see that the method is post. We have two headers. And then for the body type, again, as always, we do raw, application JSON, and the request content we can find here. Now, as you can see here in the request content, this Q basically means query. So what is the Google search query we want to receive results for? Right now, in this case, we're trying to find the LinkedIn URL of a lead, right? So we just pretend like we're adding the variable from the lead form right now, which is the name, right? So in this case, let's do mine. So this would be the variable, right? And then we can just add in LinkedIn, right? Because most likely with that Google search query, we'll get back the LinkedIn URL, right? Again, we do a parse response. And if we run this now, as you can see here in the data, then we click on organic here. Each one of these is basically a Google search result. So we get the first 10 results back, right? So you can see actually in this first one, it already found it. So we can add in a OpenAI module, of course, that can extract the right URL, right? So for example, I could say please extract the LinkedIn URL of, and then I could pass in the variable of the name again, right? So let's pretend this is a variable. Ben van Sprundel, only output the URL, nothing else. Right, then we add in the data, of course. Now we can pass in the array here, right? Really important. So because you can see we have multiple data points, if we just pass in, if we click here on organic, it won't actually receive the data, right? So we have to click in these separate. So we have the title, the link, and the snippet. That should probably be enough. And automatically we'll pass that in from each of the search results, right? Because we get it into an array. So you can see that here too, right? Because you see the square brackets, you know, it's the array of values of this specific data. So we click save, so we can try this again. And now we can see the result is my LinkedIn profile. So perfect. And now we can, of course, use a LinkedIn scraper to actually get some more data points, right? So let me show you, for example, how we do that through API-Fi. Right, so in API-Fi, again, right, we have all these scrapers, right? Now let's find the LinkedIn one. Let's say LinkedIn profile scraper, right? You can see this one actually is $25 a month, but we can have a 3-day trial. We can do a try for free. But now I actually have set this one up already. You can see here your actors, right? The ones that you use. Now I have already set this one up. So the way here on the left, actually for this LinkedIn scraper, we need to add in cookies, right? In order for it to work, right? So the way we do it here are follow these steps, right? Install cookie editor. So you can just install a quick Chrome plugin. I already have it, right? Then you'll have this appear in your plugins. Then you go to your LinkedIn profile or your LinkedIn, wherever in LinkedIn, right? You just click on that cookie button. You click on export JSON. Right, and you add that in here, right? So I can do it again, just so that's it. Now, you can adjust some other settings here if you want to, right? But all this is a little bit of a front end, basically, because if you go here on JSON, you'll see the actual settings are here. So just update the actual JSON, right? So we can copy this too. Right, and as soon as you've used this, copy this. You should have a copy button. Maybe they have, but I haven't found it. So that's it. Then you go back to make.com, right? And let's see, make.com, which one? This one. Right, and then we actually have a native integration here with Appify, as you can see, right? The way you connect this, mine is already connected, but in this case, we're going to go for run an actor, right? And the way you connect it is through your API key. Now, the API key, where can you find it? If you go back to Appify, you can just go here to settings, API and integrations, and here you have your API key. So you can copy that in, then you have your connection set up, right? And then if you've used one already, you'll see it appear here. Right, or if you've added one in Appify. So in this case, we go for the LinkedIn profile scraper. Now we're gonna toggle run synchronously on, right? Basically, it will make sure that it's finished the scraping before it ends. Now, if you're doing a really large scraping job that takes a really long time, then maybe you want to do no and start another scenario where you actually get the results. But in this case, we're just doing this one. Then we have input JSON, which is the JSON I just copied, right? We paste that in, and you can see here we have the URLs, right? And here, of course, we would add in the variable of OpenAI, which is LinkedIn URL, right? This we don't have to change. And we click on save. Now, if we run this, you can run it. What you'll see here is we don't actually get the scraped data back yet, right? We just get status succeeded. So we've just triggered the scraper basically, but we need to add in another module here of Appify, which is get dataset items, where we actually retrieve the results, right? So we select that one. And for the dataset ID, we can find that in the output of the previous module. We go here to, if I remember correctly, here we go, default dataset ID, right? So we select this variable, data transformation, we can select clean, format JSON. Now in this case, we only want the last result, so we just limit it to 1. And that's it. And then of course, we can add in that OpenAI module at the end, right? Let's just run it. And now we should actually get the scraped data back from the LinkedIn URL. And you can see, right, occupation, right, picture, cover image, positions, right, education. So we get all the information from the LinkedIn profile. And now, of course, we can pass that into an OpenAI module. We can say something like make a summary on the lead based on again, we can add in the variable. Now you can see we have lots of data points, so we have to sort of add them in manually here. So we can, for example, go right, positions, right, and it will automatically retrieve all the 5 positions. We can go first name, already have that, occupation, education, certification. So we can add this all in, whatever is relevant to you, industry, right, location, country, job title, company LinkedIn URL, which again, we could use to scrape the company LinkedIn URL too, right? Well, let's just try this for now, just as an example, and then we run it again. And we get the summary, right? IT professional, founder of Ben AI, specializing in helping businesses become AI first companies, bachelor's degree, blah, 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 right? And then of course we can output this into a CRM, but you get the idea. Now, let me show you the last way of scraping, which is complex page scraping, which I said before, some websites have some protections in place, so we can't use these more simpler ways of scraping. So we have to use more advanced web scraping APIs. Now the best two I've found are Ninja Scraper, which is available in Rapid API and API-Fi, I think so, but for sure on Rapid API. And by far the best one we've found is Scrapify, right? So I can show you. And again, right, the most common ones you see here are e-commerce websites usually have pretty heavy protection in place. We work with a lot of e-commerce too. So for example, companies that want to scrape competitors' prices, etc. Then we use this Scrapify usually because, as you can see, they have some extra methods in place to bypass these protections, right? So we have automatic anti-bot bypass, proxy rotation, basically changing your IP so you don't request too many API requests from one IP, which usually get blocked. JavaScript rendering and real web. They mimic real web browsers, right? So if I go into the dashboard, again, these things are pretty cheap in general, right? You can see I'm here on the plan. Where are the plans? I guess the plans we can find here. Yeah. So depends on how many requests you want, but you can see 40,000 API credits is $30 a month. If we're here on the dashboard, you can basically play around with the settings too, right? So you can see we have all these extra settings here we can play around with, right? So we can put the geolocation, we have an anti-bot here, right? So we can select anti-scraping protection on, right? We have cloud browser, JavaScript rendering. Here we can put in a delay, which sometimes helps, right? And we can define that too. And here we basically can put in, just like in Appify, whatever we want to do, but usually the default works already. And then it will update it here. So we could go, for example, to the curl. If we want to use this in make.com, we can copy this. Now this one is a little bit different. We have to add this information. I'll show you quickly. to make a request. So if we have this information, of course, the URL again goes here. Right, and then we all get these data URL encode these values here. And these values we're going to add, in this case, into the query string, not in the headers, in the query string. So these are the names, right? And these are the values. Right. Now, I'll leave it for that. Like, you do that for each one. I've done enough by now. But if you can't scrape it with any of the traditional methods, try it with Scrapify, because usually it works. So that's it for scraping. Now, literally knowing this, you can basically scrape 99% of the internet. So I think this is very useful when you're building automations, because most of automations, you are going to include scraping. Now, let me go to the next section. Then we have iterators and aggregators. Now, this can be a bit confusing, especially when you're starting. And I think Make.com is a bit to blame because these icons and the names are not extremely clear, I would say. But it's not rocket science once you understand it. So why do we use these? First of all, we can use these to basically process iterators. We can use to process multiple items inside of a list or an array, right, separately, right? So if I have my example from the competitor tracker, right, we have a list of YouTube URLs, and we want to process the automation for each of the URLs separately, right? So for that, we would use an iterator, and an aggregator does the opposite, right? It takes multiple items and combines them into one. Now, to really understand how they work in Make.com, it's really important to understand bundles, right? And what bundles are in Make.com specifically. Because the way it works in Make.com is a bundle is usually just a JSON or an object with stored value, right? But in Make.com specifically, bundles are the ones that are separately processed. So as soon as you see a module outputting multiple bundles, you know that the next module is going to run the automation for each of the bundles separately, right? So it's really important to understand bundles. And basically what iterators do is, right, they take one bundle with an array, right, and output it into multiple bundles, right? That's all an iterator does. So it takes one bundle, let's say with a list of values, and then we output it into multiple bundles so that the next module is actually going to process each of the values separately. So if we go back to the automation, right, let's run this again. So what you'll see here in the Airtable module is we actually get 12 or 11 bundles back, right? And each of the bundles stores the value of the row, right, or the record in Airtable, right? And you can see, because we have 11 bundles here, the second module, the RSS module, right, which checks for the new videos, runs 11 times, as you can see, because it runs 11 times on each of the rows or records or bundles in Make.com. Now, knowing that, you might see that actually this module, Airtable, already has a built-in iterator in here. So we didn't even need to use the iterator module like here. Now, that's basically because Make.com already identifies that we most likely want to process these records or rows separately, right? So they basically added it in this iterator module inside of this module. And you'll see that happen a lot with the databases connections you have in Make.com with Google Sheets, ClickUp, CRMs. They'll automatically output it into bundles. But if you look at it, in reality, the raw data, it's just an array with objects, right? So that's it. But Make.com makes it a lot easier. Now, sometimes, of course, if it's not a built-in connection, etc., we do have to work with iterators. Like, I'm going to explain this in a second. But that's how it works. Now, if you're still confused, let me just show you a quick new example. I'm just going to show you a random example. Let's say we're just going to build a new automation. I'm just going to use some very random tools, but it's just to give you an idea of how these iterators work. So let's say we have a tool which is called the set variable, which basically just allows us to make a variable, right? So we can just say example, right? And the variable value, we're going to create an array which we want to loop over, right? So I'm just going to use a text function. Don't worry about not understanding this. I'll go over text functions later. I just want to explain how iterators work and show you how they work, right? So we're just going to make an array here. And let's say we have 3 names, right? And we're going to separate the array by comma, right? So what you'll see is this tool will run once, of course, right? And we only have one bundle, and in the output we get an array, because that's what I did with the function, right? So we get 3 values with 3 names. Now let's say we want to process each name separately, right? So we're gonna do an automation with these names or whatever, and we want to run it on each of the ones separately, and we don't have that built-in functionality like with Airtable. Then we would add in an iterator, right? And we add in that array, right? And we run it, and you can see now we get 3 bundles back, right? So I can show it even clearer if we do another set variable, example 2, and I put in this example of the name, right? What you'll see now is that this one ran 3 times. So after the iterator module, who separated the array into multiple bundles, now this next module ran 3 times, right? So that's how it works. Now for aggregators, it's the opposite, right? So let's say, and it's important to understand that aggregators, they take multiple bundles. So if I go back to the presentation, really important to understand, right? They combine multiple bundles into one bundle, right? So it can only take multiple bundles and output it into one bundle. That's why I think the name is a little bit confusing, because it can't just take any array inside of one bundle. It can only take multiple bundles, which of course is an array, but it can only take multiple bundles and make one bundle. So let's say for that Airtable one, now this is a bad example, of course, because but whatever, it's just as an example. We want to take these 11 bundles and output it only in one, right? So we can use an array aggregator, right? And here we can then choose which values from all of the separate bundles we want to combine into one bundle. So let's say we want the channel, let's say the video views, right? We can run it. And what you'll see now is instead of these 11 bundles, in the output, we only get one bundle with an array with all the values, right? Now, let's say we want to combine all of this into a text, because now we're getting an array back, right, from the array aggregator. We actually want to send a text to, for example, send a notification. And we have one more option, which is text aggregator, right? So let's say we want to combine it into text and not into an array. We can go to tools, right? And here we have 3 options, which are called aggregators. Now, these 2 you're not going to use a lot, but you can also do numeric aggregators and table aggregators. In this case, we're doing text. And then we can just define, let's say, we want to combine the subscriber count, right? So now you can see we get all of the subscriber counts from all of the ones back into one bundle. And then, of course, we could send a notification with all that information. Now, bad example, but it's just to give you an idea. So now let me show you how this one works, this iterator, why it is there. So I think there's a mistake here. Yes. So the reason why is because this transcript, I'm going to show you this in a better way. I'm just going to run this again. The reason why is because this scraper here, the way it outputs the transcript is in a really confusing way. As you can see here, data, we get transcripts, and then we get a huge array, and basically it separates each of the sentences, as you can see, into a different object here, right? So we have a huge array with literally thousands of sentences. Now, if we try to pass this through this data, this array, through OpenAI to summarize the transcript, it's not going to be able to recognize this data structure. So what we have to do is we have to aggregate it, right? We have to put it all into one. Now, the problem is this is only one bundle, right? Remember, array aggregators or text aggregators can't take one bundle array and put it into one. They can only put multiple bundles into one. So that's why we first have to iterate over each of these sentences with an iterator. So we get multiple bundles with the text of each sentence, and then we can combine it all into one, right? So that's exactly what we're doing here, right? We pass in that array, right? So just to show you, we pass in this entire array, and it's important to select the entire array, not the value, because then we're only selecting one. And what you can see here is in the output, instead we get one bundle as an input with the array, and the output puts it out in hundreds, thousands of bundles. right? And then of course we can use the text aggregator to combine, and you can see you get the different values here already, and we can just select the text and we can combine all of these bundles into one text, right? And as you can see here in output, that's what happens. Right, here we get the entire transcript. And then of course we can pass it into ChatGPT. I hope that clarifies it a bit. You probably have to play around with it a bit for you to really understand it, but after a while, I think these iterators and aggregators, they start to make sense. Then we have some other built-in tools, right? In Make.com, I've covered a few already. I think we've covered most of them, but let me show you quickly. So here we can go in tools, right? And we have get multiple variables, get variable, just gets the value of a previously stored variable. You don't use this a lot. You can increment function, don't really use this. These you sometimes use, set multiple variables or set variables. We can basically create a new variable. For example, we can change the name, but in practice, we use this more, for example, new variable to add a function. Right now, functions are another thing in Make.com where we can basically transform data in a fast and efficient way. Now, I'm going to go over functions at the end of this video at the advanced skills, but I'll just show you a quick example why you'd need a set variable. So let's say we have a variable and we use a trim function here, and a trim function, for example, removes space characters at the start or end of a text, which is you sometimes have to use, for example, when you going to use an API call that after, and API request bodies usually can give errors if there are too many spaces, especially at the beginning of the end or the end. So then we can use, for example, this trim function. If I, for example, just put in a random value here with some spaces, with a space in front and after, and we click save and we run this module, you'll see that it comes out without a space, right? And of course, we have access to a new variable in the next module. Right, so if we, let's say Slack, create a message, you'll see now we have a new variable. So that's the set variable. Then of course we have the sleep, which also covered, mostly used, for example, for these API calls when you actually have to wait. It takes a little bit of time before you can get it back, or you have to do another API call to actually retrieve back the results. Then these sleep modules are common, right? You can just type in sleep, and then you have a delay of maximum 300 if you need more, 300 seconds. If you need more, you can just string along a few of these sleep tools. Right. Also commonly, for example, we use it also, we do an inbound lead email. Now, we don't want to send that immediately, so it doesn't look like an automated email. So we actually wait a little bit with the sleep module. And then we really have covered most of the important or all of the important built-in modules in Make.com. The only thing we're missing here is the directives, right? And those are the error handlers. And error handlers are important to understand, especially if you're going to run important workflows, or if you're going to give workflows or build workflows for clients. Now, why are error handlers important? Because first of all, APIs fail. Sometimes they are run usually on external services. We don't have them under control, and they do run into issues, right? So it's important, first of all, to have error handlers on APIs. And second of all, the important thing we want to do is add in notifications. So if something goes wrong, we do want to be notified so we can adjust the workflow and update it. And thirdly, I would want to say most automations are going to run into issues, right? You can test it all you want. If you actually run it into production and it runs on a daily basis on high volume tasks, things will go wrong, right? So really important to add in error handlers, especially on critical workflows, important business workflows where data cannot be lost, and if you're going to deliver this to clients, right? So those are the two important things, right? Add in error handlers and notifications. Now, Make.com already allows us a really easy way to add in notifications, right? You can just here go to your profile, right? And let's say save. And here you have email preferences. Now, in general, you want to turn these two on, right? For errors and warnings, you get notified. Now, don't do this when you're testing and you're building in your client's account, for example, because they'll get scared. And while testing, of course, you're running into lots of issues. So if I go back, I'll show you the error handling. So in practice, you're really only going to use maybe two of these I personally use only 2 of these others. I don't really have found a good reason to use them. The most commonly used is the break module. And the break module, basically what it does, it just, if there's an error, let's say in an API call, right, it will just try again, wait 15 minutes and then try again, right? So, and here we can define how often, and then try again. Because APIs, for some reason, they sometimes just fail, and nobody knows why, but they really do. So it is important, basically, for any important workflow or workflow you're going to deliver to a client, add in one of these break modules at each of the API steps. So in this case, I would add it here in OpenAI, Airtable, and Airtable. So all the APIs are covered. And it really does resolve most of the issues with just a simple break module, right? So I literally added on all 3. So if we test this, it won't work actually, because you have to change the settings for error handlers to be able to work, right? So in settings, we have to change this setting here, allow storing, of incomplete executions. And this is why it's also really important, these error handlers, because if something goes wrong, we're basically storing the data inside of these incomplete executions, so it doesn't get lost, right? Really important in important workflows where data can't get lost, right? This is really good. And then we can actually go in after and resolve the issue, so we actually don't lose any important workflow or data, right? So let's say we just add in an error here. I'm going to add in the method put, right? Which is obviously it's not. So then you can see it runs into an error. Now, of course, we get notified, first of all. And second of all, now we can go here in incomplete executions, and you'll see now the error, right? And now we can actually go back into this specific workflow, resolve the error. I have to save it, resolve the error, run it again. And now the data is actually being processed, right? So we don't lose any data like this. That's why error handling is important. So what other error handlers do we have? The only one you might use is maybe the ignore module. And basically what an ignore error handler does is if there's an error, it just completely ignores it, right? Now the only reason why I've used this is because some APIs have returned me errors while they actually were processed correctly. So if that happened, if you see that happen, it's really annoying, because if a workflow runs into an error, I think 3 times, it automatically deactivates while it was actually processed correctly. So if I notice that, then I might add an ignore module, because then it basically ignores the error and doesn't deactivate the workflow. So that's the only use case I found for this ignore. So that's it for error handlers. I think quite straightforward, but important to know. And I know many people don't actually use it. So important to just add it on all the API calls. It will resolve a lot of headaches in the future, especially if you're working with clients. So that's really it for all the important modules and skills. I will cover some more advanced ones at the end, but now I'm going to dive into AI, which is really going to put our automations. Now let's get to the interesting part, AI integration. Now, of course, now that we have AI, these automation solutions we can build can really become 10 times as powerful as they traditionally were, right? Because besides just passing data from one API or software to the other, now we can actually do something with that data in the middle, right? And that really allows us to automate much more complex systems and even entire workflows of humans, right? And it can also entirely transform business models, right? I'm going to get practical by the end of this section, where I'm going to build something from scratch. I'm going to build a lead generation system, and maybe we can add a personalized outreach system on top of that, which I think will really help you understand how to build out your first automations and also to see this in practice. But before I want to get practical, I do want to go over the foundations. So first I'll show you Make.com AI tools. They have some simple built-in AI tools. And then I'll go over some of the fundamentals that I think are really important to understand before you start building automation solutions with AI. Many people skip over this, but I think it's really important to understand the types of LLMs, the LLM use cases, understanding prompting frameworks, right? And also for different types of LLMs. Now, these are really important because most people are used to prompting inside of ChatGPT. And in ChatGPT, we don't really need prompting frameworks or best practices, etc., because we can just go back and forth. And if something goes wrong, we just correct the model to get the final outcome. But in these automation solutions or systems, we of course run this on hundreds or thousands of tasks. And this system has to work reliably, right? So we have to really work and guide these LLMs very well to make sure it performs reliably on large volume tasks, right? And that's why prompting frameworks and incorporating best practices is really important, right? Then I'll go over choosing LLMs, prompt chaining, and AI agents. And then again, as I said, I'll build something from scratch, which puts this theory, I think, a bit more in practice. So let me go first to the Make.com AI tools. So again, this is a new feature of Make.com. Maybe it's not new if you're watching this video a few months after I've released it, but right now it's new. It's actually in the beta version, so you either might not have access to it yet, or it's an outdated feature. But basically what Make.com has done, and I can show you very quickly, is they now have a built-in AI tools module. And basically what they've done is take the most common use cases for AI and build it directly into Make.com. So you can see we have analyze sentiment, request anything, categorize text, identify language, standardize text, summarize the text, translate text, right? So basically how this works is if I click this, for example, translate text, we don't actually need to connect OpenAI or Google Gemini or Claude. We can just do this inside of Make.com, and we don't even have to prompt the model, right? The module is already pre-prompted, so it makes it a lot easier for us for these simpler use cases. So for example, if I go and type something in Dutch, and we want to translate it to English, if I run this now, you'll see I get the translation, right? So that's it. As you can see, we have some other options. We can say, for example, categorize the text, also a common use case, right? Let's say we have an email. Hi, I'm interested in your services, right? And in here we can define the categories, right? Let's say leads, promotions, and spam, right? Make.com will already have this sort of pre-prompted, making it a lot easier for us for these simpler use cases. So yes. Right, and we get the category here. Let's see, leads. So did that correctly, and then it gives a reason to. So that's the Make.com AI tools. You can see I have a few more, and I think very soon they will add AI agents here. Unfortunately, we don't have AI agents in Make.com yet, but very soon they're going to release them. And as soon as I do, I will record another video on that. So that's it for the Make.com AI tools. So then I want to go over very quickly the types of LLMs. You might already know, but it's still important to understand. We basically have two types of LLMs at the moment, right? We have the non-reasoning LLMs, and the non-reasoning LLMs are generally faster, cheaper to run, and better for simpler tasks. And examples we all know, I think, are the GPT-4o, Claude 3.5, Gemini Flash. Each of the language model providers will have non-reasoning LLMs, and now we also have reasoning LLMs, right? And reasoning LLMs are generally slower, more expensive, but a lot better for more complex tasks, right? And examples are GPT-03, GPT-01, DeepSeek, Gemini 2.0 Thinking, etc. And the best analogy I've heard for these two types of models are these are basically system 1 level thinkers, and these are system 2 level thinkers. And what's the difference? We as humans use system 1 level thinking for very easy and simple and intuitive tasks. For example, if we play a game of tic-tac-toe, we don't really have to reason and think hard for our next move, right? It's pretty straightforward. So we can make an intuitive, fast decision. And then we have system 2 level thinking, where we require a lot more planning and reasoning to take an action. For example, playing chess, right? And I like this analogy because I think we can think of these types of LLMs very much like this, right? Reasoning LLMs are a lot better when we have a complex task that requires planning and reasoning. And these models are better for simple, straightforward tasks. So that's it for the types of LLMs. Then we have the LLM use cases. Now, basically, I've identified sort of the main types of use cases we will find inside of these automation systems, right? Now, these are very broad categories. Of course, there are a lot of subcategories underneath each of these use cases, but I do want to lay it out to give you sort of a framework on understanding when you should use which type of LLM, and also with when you should use which type of prompting framework, which I'll go over in a second. So I basically have 6 here, right? The first one is extracting data. Now, it's a very common use case, right, in these AI systems, and LLMs are generally really good. Like, for example, we want to extract a specific data point from a scraped LinkedIn profile, right? That's a very common use case we use in these automation solutions, or even summarizing it. Now, again, LLMs are generally very good when they have a large context to extract specific data from it, or even summarize that data. Right, then we have generation, again, very broad topic. But what I mean with generation is when an LLM has to generate a piece of content without a lot of context, right? And needs a lot more creativity, right? So, for example, writing a report, writing a personalized email, etc. Then we have classification and categorization, again, common use case, right? Categorizing emails. Then we have evaluation, again, can overlap a bit with classification or categorization, but evaluation, for example, we can think of sentiment analysis, or even evaluating if outputs from other LLM models are actually good or not, right? That's also a common use case. Then we have data transformation. For example, we need to structure a specific piece of text in a specific format. We need HTML format, we need code generation, we need JSON, things like this. Very common use case too. And then we have decision making, and decision making is most commonly used inside of AI agents, right? AI agents have to usually plan and reason and think of which tools to use to execute a workflow, right? Or to get to an outcome that requires decision making. So these are the main use cases. Again, take this with a grain of salt. There are a lot of subcategories, but I just put them here to give you sort of a general guideline on choosing LLMs and choosing prompting framework. So let me get to the prompting frameworks. Now, again, you might think, why do I even need prompting frameworks? I use ChatGPT or Claude on a daily basis and it works perfectly fine. Again, it's because that what we're doing inside of those apps is conversational prompting, right? And conversational prompting is very different than the prompting we use inside of these automation systems, because we don't have the flexibility of going back and forth until we get the right outcome. We always need the right outcome on a consistent basis. And even when it runs on hundreds or thousands of tasks, it always has to perform reliably, right? And therefore, it's really important to incorporate proven best practices of prompting LLMs to make sure we get it as reliable as possible. And the best way I find to do that is through prompting frameworks. Now, just as a disclaimer, this is not the only prompting framework or the best prompting framework. This is just a prompt framework that we use internally in our agency, and it helps us structure our prompts, make sure we incorporate proven best practices, but also aligns the way we write prompts across our entire agency. So it's easy for us to adapt. And the third big reason, I think, is it gives you a structure in your head for how to write prompts in a consistent basis that you most likely will perform reliably at scale, right? That's the important thing. So for prompting non-reasoning LLMs, we basically use two prompting frameworks. We have the short structured prompting framework and a long structured prompting framework. This is just how we call it, right? But short structured prompting frameworks we use for simpler tasks, and long structured prompting framework we use for more complex tasks. And then for reasoning models, we have a different prompting framework, because we actually have to prompt reasoning models very different than non-reasoning LLMs, right? Non-reasoning LLMs in general need a lot more guidance and guardrails to perform reliably. Therefore, we need to give it lots more context. So for the short structured prompt, again, for simpler tasks, we basically divide it into 4 sections. We have the role and objective, we have the instructions or rules, we have examples, and we have variables. Now, for the role and objective, we basically just give it a role and a direct description of the task. Now, why do we do this? Because it's studied and proven that it most likely improves performance of these models, right? So we're just giving it a specific role. In this case, you're a world-class email parser. Your task is to identify and extract the invoice number in the email below, right? So you can see I actually start this section with this numeric symbol, which basically makes this an H1. So it makes it a header. And we do this because LLMs actually understand Markdown formatting. So they can actually see, okay, this is sort of the structure of the prompt, right? So we usually tend to do this, right? Role and objective, your world-class email parser, right? Again, you want to hype it up a bit and tell it how good it is, right? So we use world-class or expert, etc. Then we have the second section, which is the instructions, where we basically include all the important rules, the output formats, if we need specific output formats, and we correct potential mistakes. So you can see the example here, instructions, again, with the numeric symbol to give it an H1. And then we say, identify and extract only the invoice number from an email, nothing else, right? So that's rule number 1. It's important in these systems to always instruct these kinds of things. In general, a lot of times we're going to pass the output of the language model into an API or into next model, etc. So it's very important that the output is formatted correctly. And LLMs, if you don't say, for example, there's nothing else, they tend to start explaining, hey, the invoice number I found is this, right? Now, if a language model does that, of course, the API call is going to give an error. We only need the number, right? So it's very important to instruct these nothing else, for example. And then the second rule we have here is if no invoice number is available, only output not available, nothing else. And this is what I mean here with correct potential mistakes. It's really important in these automation systems to instruct language models what to do if something goes wrong or it doesn't have access to a specific piece of information, etc. Because first of all, our automation will break if it doesn't happen. And second of all, language models are very happy to make up this content if we don't define what it should do if it doesn't have access to a specific data point, right? So it's always important to instruct what to do if something goes wrong, right? Because also then we can use this not available, for example, as a filter or a router inside of our scenario to make sure that our automation doesn't break. Then we have examples. Examples is one of the most studied principles in prompting, especially for these non-reasoning LLMs, right? Giving it input and output examples gives a lot of context to these language models, what we actually expect the language model to do, right? And what the output format should actually look like, right? So the way we do it is we have here the examples with the H1, and then we have an H2, which we do with 2 numeric symbols, example 1 and example 2. So in general, we try to add in 2 examples. Now, if it's a very simple task, we sometimes only do the output, right? In this case, the invoice. But generally, if it's a more complex task, you also want to give it an example of an input, right? So this was the input, this is the output, this was the input, this was the output, gives a lot of context on the language model, what it has to do with this new task. And then the last part is the variable section, where we basically add in any variable that we might have, which in these automation systems, again, a lot of times we have, right? So this changes depending on the task. In this case, the email you will analyze today, and then we add in a variable, right? So that's the short prompting framework. And you can start most tasks with this short prompting framework, test it out, see if it works well. But if we have more complex tasks or you see your model struggling with this short framework, we can use the long structured framework, where we basically give even more guardrails and context to the models on what to do to increase reliability, right? And we generally want to use it for the more complex task, right? So just extracting an invoice, we most likely won't need it, right? Because it's a simple task for an LLM. But generating new content, writing a report, etc., we actually need it. So the framework we use for these long structured prompts is the following. First, we have role, then we have objective. So we basically separate them to go in a little bit more detail in each one. Then we have context, instructions, examples, variables, and notes. So you can see we have some extra ones to give it more guardrails, right? So we have role here, just an example. Your world-class personalized LinkedIn outreach message assistant with a particular knack for writing highly engaging and personalized LinkedIn outreach based on the prospect data you're provided with below, right? So we go a little bit more in depth, right? Also in this specific prompt, because of course he has to start writing LinkedIn outreach messages here. So we really want to give it as much guardrails as possible to get the outcome as good as possible, right? That's why we use the long one here. And we have the objective. You can see in the objective, I'm a lot more detailed too. Your goal is to think step by step through the following process to ensure the highest quality outcome. Right? I use this step by step because this is what they call chain of thought, which might improve the results of these prompts a bit. And then I have 3 points. You'll read and analyze the context about me and my company to understand fully who the outreach messages are written from. You'll then read and analyze the prospect data, which consists of a prospect summary and his last LinkedIn post, so you understand fully who the outreach messages are written to. You'll then write a sequence of 3 engaging personalized LinkedIn outreach messages based on the data you've analyzed and the detailed instructions here below. Right. Then I add in context. Now this might also improve the performance, basically giving more context to the LLM on why it's doing this task. Right. So just giving it some context on why this task is important can also improve the results of your prompts. Right. So you'll write these messages for me and my company. The task is crucial for generating new potential customers to our business. Then we have instructions again. Now you can see these instructions are a lot more detailed. And basically here at the top, I give 2 important instructions. First, for the output format, always use a valid JSON in your output, just like in the examples. Start your answers with and that's a JSON, the symbol for the JSON, right? Curly bracket. This is usually useful to use when you're trying to get your model to output JSON, because sometimes they do it wrong. And then we have specific instructions and rules for each of the messages, right? You go on the first outreach message is to establish a LinkedIn connection. The only goal is making that connection. You're going to establish that connection by finding some common ground or common characteristic that is relevant and a valid reason to establish a professional connection. So really important for those outreach messages, in my experience, to give them lots of guardrails, because if we give too much freedom or we don't instruct properly how to write these outreach messages, we usually get really bad copy, right? So you can see I have lots of instructions here for each message specifically too. Then I give it examples, right? And again, it's in the JSON format. Then the variables, where I give it more context, right? The variables for this prompt. Here's my company's info, right? And here's information on the prospect, right? Prospect profile and prospect past LinkedIn posts. And then we add in a last one, which is notes. And in the notes section, we can basically double down on important rules. In this case, I add in user valid JSON, right? Now, this note section is very useful, especially for these longer prompts, because LLMs in general, the non-reasoning LLMs, they take instructions given at the end and at the beginning of the prompt more into account than instructions in the middle of the prompt. So if it forgets a rule here, or there's an important rule in the middle that he's not following when you're testing it, etc., you can add it in the note section, and probably he will correct itself pretty quickly. So this can be very useful. So that's it for the long structured framework. And then we have prompting reasoning LLMs, which is very different, right? Because reasoning LLMs need a lot less guidance and actually perform way better with very direct prompts. They can even start really losing performance when we are too detailed. Like in that example I gave before, if we try that with a reasoning LLM, it would most likely not result in good outcomes, especially trying to give reasoning LLMs SOPs, do this first, then this, then this. It really starts to struggle in my experience because, of course, they have this reasoning built in. So in general, with reasoning LLMs, very direct prompts work best, right? So that's why I have this framework here, which is a very short framework. We only have the objective. We don't even have the role. Where, for example, write a sentiment analysis report of our company based on our scraped Trustpilot page below, right? Instructions where we can, again, put in some rules if we need them and some output instructions. So, for example, provide an overall sentiment summary indicating the percentages of positive, neutral, and negative reviews, and provide the main reasons for positive and negative reviews. If sentiment is unclear, classify as neutral. So just some rules or some specific context. And then we have the context of variables, where we give it more context. In this case, the Trustpilot page, right? The scraped Trustpilot page. But again, you can see a lot more direct, a lot more simple. We give a lot more freedom to these reasoning LLMs, and usually they perform a lot better like this. Now, when do you choose which one? Do you choose a non-reasoning or a reasoning model, and which prompt framework should you use? I just put in a general recommendation or guideline, but take this with a grain of salt, because it really depends on the specific use case you're using it for. But in general, I can sort of categorize it like this. Again, we have the 6 main types of use cases for LLMs in these automation solutions. Right, and I'll give you my general recommendation for each one. But again, take it with a grain of salt, because it depends on the complexity of the specific task. But first, we have extracting data. Now, in general, LLMs are really good at extracting data from a large context. Right, so because LLMs are really good at this, we usually can use the non-reasoning models, right, the cheaper models, and we can usually get away with a short prompting framework, right? For example, find a URL in the Google search results, right? Summarize a text, etc. Then we have classification and categorization. Again, LLMs are generally very good at this, so we can get away with short prompting frameworks and non-reasoning LLMs. And also these 2 tools, for example, are also now built into Make.com in the AI tools, which I showed you before, making it even simpler, because we don't even have to prompt it. Then we have data transformation. Still, LLMs are pretty good at this, but for some more complex things, they sometimes struggle a bit more. So in general, we can still use non-reasoning LLMs, for example, to convert a text to HTML. And generally, we can get away with a short prompting framework. Now, if we use it for more advanced use cases, maybe we want to generate code, then, of course, we want to try using reasoning models, because reasoning models are exceptionally good at code generation. Then we have evaluation. Now, generally, they're also very good at evaluation. For example, sentiment analysis or RAG retrieval evaluation, which is a common use case when you're using AI agents, for example. Now, here we can go with reasoning models. I tend to see with evaluation or sentiment analysis, because it's sort of subjective, reasoning models can sometimes perform better, or we can still use non-reasoning models with long prompting frameworks, in my experience. Then we have generation, of course, where we want an LLM to generate something like these LinkedIn messages or writing a report or writing a personalized email. Now, this is where LLMs struggle the most. So we want to give them as much guardrails as possible if we're using a non-reasoning model. So we want to use the long prompting framework, or we can try and use a reasoning model, right? And with these tasks, we can try both too and see which output you like. But keep in mind that with reasoning models, it tends to be a lot because we give it less guardrails. The output consistency will be less sort of standardized, right? Because we're giving more freedom to the LLM, and it might result in a better outcome, but it also means we might have sort of diverging types of answers, right? Well, if we use a non-reasoning model with a long structured prompting framework, we might have a more sort of reliable and consistent output. And then last one is decision making, which we mostly use in AI agents, right? And in AI agents for decision making, because of course it requires a lot of planning and reasoning to take the right actions, to use the right tools. I think we will see more and more reasoning models, and people will use more and more reasoning models inside of agents, also when they become cheaper. Or we can still use non-reasoning models, but with a long agent prompting framework, which is a bit different. I have another video on this, on how to prompt specifically for agents. So if you want to check that out, I'll make sure to link it up here. And then lastly, we have prompt chaining, which is important to understand, and you're going to use a lot in these automation systems. Now, why do we use prompt chaining? Because LLMs are not great at performing multiple tasks, right? So we never really want to instruct these LLM modules inside of an automation system to do multiple tasks inside of one prompt. So, for example, we don't want to instruct a model to extract data points, specific data points, and make a summary from a scraped LinkedIn post and generate a personalized email inside of the same prompt, right? We want to separate those two into two different AI modules, right? So each of the prompts and the AI modules has one specific task, right? The smaller we can keep the task, the higher the reliability will become, right? So I put a line here, which I like, is if you're finding problems or struggling with consistent outputs in your AI or in your AI module, right? Usually the solution is adding more AI, right? The solution to the problems of AI is usually more AI. And that means usually breaking it up into multiple AI steps and breaking a larger complex task into multiple steps. And we use the outputs from the previous module into the next module. And that's how we can get the consistency and the reliability a lot higher. Now, let's put this all a bit more in practice by building something from scratch, which I think gives you a good idea of how to start building automation systems. So we can build maybe a lead generation system, and maybe we can add in a personalized email outreach or even a personalized LinkedIn outreach, as I showed you that prompt before. So if I go back into make.com, we create a new scenario. Now, for lead generation, what's a really interesting one is in Appify, we have an Apollo scraper. If you don't know Apollo, it's basically a platform to find new leads, right? And their contact information, like emails and LinkedIn. So before I approach this, I probably think like, what do I need? First of all, I need the Apollo scraper to generate new leads. Then we can probably scrape their LinkedIn to get some more data points. Maybe we can even scrape their last LinkedIn post. So we can do a personalized outreach based on their last LinkedIn post, which can be a bit more personal and more relevant. And then we can add it all to maybe a Google Sheet, right? Of course, this could also be a CRM, but let's do Google Sheet for now. So here we are in Apollo. So first I'll go to Appify and show you the scraper. So if we go Apollo, you have Apollo scraper here, scrape up to 50,000 leads, right? And you pay $1.20 for 1,000 leads, which is a lot cheaper than if you use Apollo yourself. So let's just try this one. I already have it inside of my Appify. But as you can see, what we need here is the search URL, So we basically can put in the search filters in Apollo, we add that link, and then it will scrape that link, and it will even scrape multiple pages. Right, and here we can also decide the amount of leads we want to scrape, but let's keep it at 500. So let's first do a search. Let's say for example, we want to scrape some leads from my AI services. So here we can define the filter. So let's say we want leads from the US. Right, we want leads that work in a specific industry. Let's say software. When you're doing this in general lead generation, you want to be as specific as possible, because otherwise you get lots of search results and they might not be extremely well suited for your business. Company size, we can also define. Let's say, I think we have to do that here in companies first. Okay, so we have software. Let's say employees between 51 to 100. Again, account location, United States. So important for this scraper, we can only scrape lead, like people, right? But we can still add in the filters of the companies. As you can see, they're applied here. And we can say we only want to target founders, or founder, I should say, or CEOs. We can add in co-founder and maybe owner. Good. Normally you would want to define this a bit more specific, but here we go, 2,100 results. So all I do now is I just copy this URL and I go to the Apollo scraper here, and here we can add in the URL. Now, of course, you can also make this a variable, for example, but let's see, like, so here I basically add the settings, and then the JSON here will be updated, right? So we can copy this JSON, we go back into make.com, and of course, now we go to the Apify scraper, we go run an actor. Again, if you haven't connected, right, you can connect your Apify account through the API key in Apify, just showed before. And if you've already used that specific scraper, you'll see it appear here. If not, you can also select it manually here. So we go with the Apollo scraper. Now in this case, this Apollo scraper, for example, takes quite a while, a few minutes, because of course it's scraping multiple pages. So we want to run it. We don't want to run it synchronously, because it's going to wait before it ends. And sometimes it can time out with these long sort of scrapers. So we're going to choose no. We're going to add in the JSON, and you can see we already have the URL. Now, of course, you could make this a variable too. And you could change here the amount, etc. But in this case, we're just going to use it like this. And here, this we don't really have to change. So we click save. And now, of course, because it's going to run synchronously, and you remember if you saw the earlier example of the Apify I used, we don't get the results back right away, right? We have to use another module to get the results back, right? Now, of course, it will take a few minutes before that module, before this scraper is actually done, right? So we have to add in a sleep module. So we can add in a sleep module. Let's say, I think the 300 seconds will be enough, right? And then we choose the get dataset items, right? And with this module, we get back the data of the scraper. Now we have to add in the dataset ID. So we have to first run this to get access to this variable, right? And when you're building, you constantly have to do that usually to know, to give Make context on what variables it can expect from this earlier module. That's the only way we can add in these variables. Now in this case, let's see, maybe we already have it. We actually have it here. But normally, sometimes you have to run it first, so Make.com knows which variables you have access to. But here we have the default dataset ID, so we can use that one. Data transformation, we go clean, and let's just, for testing, limit it to only 3 results. Now, I'm just gonna, of course, this is gonna fail, right? But I don't wanna wait 5 minutes in the testing, so just put it on 1 second. And you can see it returned 0 bundles because of course it's still running. If we look at this one, it's still running, right? So probably in a few minutes, we'll get back the data. And normally, of course, we put this on 300 seconds. So it will have enough time to actually retrieve the results. Now in the meantime, we can work on the next step. So the next step could be, what I already know is from this Apollo scraper, we usually get back the LinkedIn of the lead, right? So we can add in a LinkedIn scraper here to get some more data on that lead, which we can then use, of course, to personalize our outreach. And we also want to add in another scraper that can scrape their last LinkedIn post. So I already know that scraper I don't think it's available on Apify. So we're going to use Rapid API because I know they have a scraper that scrapes last LinkedIn posts. I think it's the LinkedIn data API. Which one is it? Let's check. I think it's this one. So you can see here on the left the options we get, right? So we can get person data, which basically scrapes the LinkedIn profile data, right? Like the about, the work history, etc. But we also have an option here of the person's post, right? So their last post we can also scrape, and we can also scrape a company's data, right? Sales Navigator, etc. So this is a good one. So let's just set this one up. Now you know how we set up these APIs. So we can see request this post. So we go to the HTTP, make a request, because Rapid API doesn't have a native integration. I'm probably on the wrong one. Person data. Yes, I am. So this URL. For the headers, you can see we have 3 headers. As always, the content type with the value application JSON. And the last header is API key. Now for the body type, we always go with raw. Again, application JSON, and here we post in the request body, which we can also find here. And you can already see that the request body is the link, which of course in our case we're going to make into a variable. Now, as you can see, because that module before didn't run yet, we don't have access to that variable yet, right? So first we have to run that one. And I think by now our scraper is done. So we can test this one. And what you'll see is if I do run this module only, because we've defined this variable, we can only run this module, of course, by defining the variable. So when you're testing, you just want to do this manually, right? So you can just go here, look at what the default dataset ID is, and then we can run it manually like that. Let me see where it is. Default dataset ID. So paste it in just to be able to test it, right? And now you can see we get some results back. So I defined 3, right? So you can see we got 3 bundles back, 3 different leads, right? And you can see we get quite a few data points already: the name, last name, title, the LinkedIn profile, headline, and some other information. So now we can actually map this here as the variable, LinkedIn URL, and we click parse response. And now this one should be set up. Now what we can do in order to test this one is just for the testing purposes, we can unlink this just so we don't have to run the whole process again and let the scraper scrape 500 leads again. We can just, for testing purposes, put this trigger module on this one. So we run it from this one. Now again, it's going to ask for that dataset ID, right? Which again, we're going to just put in manually. So if we now click here on run once, of course, you can see now the variable isn't defined because it's not connected, right? So it doesn't have access to that variable. So we can just, for testing purposes, put it in manually. and afterwards we're going to map it. You can see there are 3 bundles here with 3 different leads. So of course the scraper is going to run 3 times, as you can see. And now we should have 3 scraped LinkedIn profiles. If we here go to data, we can see we get all the information from the LinkedIn profile of that lead. So we get experience, education, languages, everything we need to make a personalized LinkedIn outreach, right? Now we want to add in one more scraper, which is the last LinkedIn post, to make it even more personalized. So we're going to add in another rapid API call, right, for the LinkedIn post scraper. Now just copy this one because I know that some of the headers are going to be the same. So now I go here to get person posts. Now this is a GET request, as you can see here. So here we have the URL. You can see inside of the URL, they put in the LinkedIn profile that's going to be scraped, where the posts are going to be scraped from, right? So this, we of course want to change into the variable. I think it's until here. Yes, it should be until here. So here we get the LinkedIn URL, right? So we're adding that variable. Now see, there's some more things defined here, which is page is 1, repost is 1, comments is 1. So probably these are filters. So let me get back here. If we go here in params, yeah, you can see here we can define if it filters for only posts that are reposts or have comments. Now we don't necessarily want that, so you can see that they're optional. So we actually don't want those, and you can see that the URL actually changed, right? So we don't have that in the URL anymore. So I can just take this out, and only page 1. Right, we can scrape multiple pages of post 2 if we want, but let's just do 1 for now. We don't want to reference a post they made a long time ago. So get, now let's check the headers. 2 headers in this case. And the API key will already be the same, right? For the one we already have. So you can just change this one. And this one's not necessary for this GET request. And you can see we're also, because it's a GET request, we don't have a request body, so we can leave this empty. So now we should be good for this one. So again, let's test it out. And again, it's going to run it 3 times on each of the leads. And we can check already if it was successful. Here we can see the posts. So this person only had 2 posts, but you can see we get their last LinkedIn post. Now that's all good. Now, of course, we want to generate a personalized outreach message for LinkedIn based on the data we got from these scraped LinkedIn profile and LinkedIn posts. So all we're going to do here is add in an OpenAI module. Now, if you don't know how to connect OpenAI, it's quite simple. You can just go to platform.openai.com. Right there, you log into your OpenAI account. And once you're in your account, you can just click here on dashboard, I think, or on the settings button, and there you have an option of API keys. You can create a new key. So make.com. We create a new key, we copy that. We go back to make.com, right? And if we're in the OpenAI module, we can go create a completion. And here, if you're going to add an account, right, all you have to do is add in your API key there. Now, mine's already connected, but that's how you set it up. Now, for the modules, very quickly, you can see we actually have lots of modules available of OpenAI. So we have message and assistant. An assistant basically means an assistant in OpenAI is basically like an AI agent, right? So we can set up an AI agent inside of OpenAI too, right? Create a completion is just a simple prompt, basically, which in this case is what we need, right? And we have transform text to structured data, which is going to be very useful in these types of automation because you can basically get structured data. Let's say I want to extract 5 data points from that LinkedIn profile, and I all want to separate them into separate variables so I can later add them to a Google Sheets. Then we can just use this and it will automatically structure the data, and we can just define the variables it has to output the data into. So very useful. This is very annoying. Then we have analyze images. So it's a vision model, right? We can generate images, we can edit in an image, we can create a translation, which now Make.com AI tools also has. Then we can create a transcription from an audio file, right? Moderation, generate an audio. Then we have add files to a vector store. So let's say we work with an assistant, an agent, and we want to give it a knowledge base with specific information. For example, that example I gave before, the Make.com documentation pages, so we can make an agent that has that specific knowledge. Then we could just add that to a vector store, and we give that to an assistant, so it has that specific knowledge, right? And that's also related to these batches. So that's it. For this case, we just need a completion module. Now here we can choose the model. Now in this case, we want to give it a lot of guardrails for writing this personalized message, because we're generating content, right? So we want to give it a lot of guardrails. And I prefer the non-reasoning models for these kinds of tasks, because the reasoning models will have more freedom and less consistency in this sense. So I prefer for these types of prompts and for these personalized outreach messages, etc., to put in a lot of guardrails and use a non-reasoning model. So we're going to use GPT-4o. And what you can see here, I'm going to explain this very slow, this module in Make.com for some reason, is we have 3 options here. We have user, assistant, and developer and system. Now the system, we can basically use for the role prompt, right? So they sort of separated it because it might improve the performance a bit if we just put the role prompt here in the system, right? So let's say we can say role, right? You are world-class LinkedIn. So your world-class LinkedIn outreach message generator for my company, Ben AI. You'll personalize the messages based on the LinkedIn data of the lead below, right? Just the role prompt. And then we can add in the user prompt where we put in the entire prompt. So let me put in the prompt and I'll get back to you in a sec. So I've put in a prompt. I adjusted the system prompt a bit. Your world-class LinkedIn outreach message generator for my company, Ben AI. You'll personalize the messages based on the LinkedIn data of the lead below. Right, your goal is, as my world-class outreach message writers, to think step-by-step through the following process to ensure the highest quality outcome. Now, I took this one from the example in the Gamma. You'll read and analyze the context about me and my company to ensure you fully understand who the outreach message is written from. You'll then read and analyze the prospect data and his post. You'll then write a personalized LinkedIn outreach message based on the data you have analyzed. Then I give it some context. Why is this important? You'll write these messages for me and my company. This task is crucial for generating new potential customers to our business. Now, I'm very clear in the instructions here, because these outreach messages, again, you want to give it lots of guardrails. Your goal in the outreach message to establish a LinkedIn connection. The only goal is to making that connection. You're going to establish a connection by finding some common ground or common characteristic that is relevant and provides a valid reason. Now, really important to say these, right? Because you've probably experienced this. If you don't give them a lot of guardrails, they're going to send really salesy outreach messages, right? So, for example, it is vital to my career. You'll never pitch our services or ask questions in this message. So this, by the way, is what they call an emotional manipulation. These models, it might sound weird, but it actually might improve outcomes, right? There have been some studies. If there's a relevant LinkedIn post of the prospect that could naturally lead to you sending a connection request, that would be the preferred type of personalization for this message. So if we can find something interesting on their last LinkedIn post, then that is the best way. Always follow the tone of voice of the examples below. Almost mimic them. I always say this for trying to let them follow the tone of voice as much as possible. It is vital to my career. You keep this message concise and clear. You'll never write more than 2 sentences, and you can never use more than 300 characters. And then, of course, I have examples. So in this case, I just have one example, but what I usually do is I let it run on a few examples. And then if I find a good one, I add some more examples in there. But instead of wasting lots of time on writing out examples, just let the model run. And if you like a few, add them into the examples, because it really helps hone down that tone of voice. And then I have the variables, right? Important context on my company and the lead, right? And then I have the H2 header here with me and my company's info, right? Just some info on what I do and what my company does. And then here we, of course, have the lead's LinkedIn profile data and the lead's last LinkedIn post. Now, this we have to add, right? So for the last LinkedIn post, we can go here on post, right? And here we find the post text, right? So we can just add that. And here for the lead's LinkedIn profile data, we have to go to the other module. Now you can see this is actually a collection, right? Now, collections, you can't pass on directly to a language model, right? It won't work. It's just the way make.com works. So you can do this by through another module, which is create a string, which is a built-in tool in make.com, or you can just separate the values you want to pass over here separately. So let's say we're going to pass over the name, right? We're going to do the headline, let's say maybe you can do something with the country, experiences. This could be interesting. Title, education. And maybe we can add in some scales. Maybe, let's see, I forget something important. Let's just keep it at this and see what happens, right? We can add in some more data points, but let's just add in this and see what the model does. And then lastly, I have the notes section where I double down on that tone of voice. Now, again, if you see something going wrong, it's great in general, great to add this to the notes, right, when you're testing. So let's try this out. By the way, you do have some more options here, right? You can also add in images, of course, and you can also do the response format. So you can have this structured output directly in this completion model too. So we can sort of force it to output it into a JSON object. Now, in this case, not very necessary. You can also define the max completion tokens, right? The maximum number of tokens to use in a completion in the outputs, right? So we can actually define that for this one, for example, because we know we can't pass more than 300 words. So you could play around with that. Then we have the temperature and some other options that you won't really need in practice. So let's just run it. Let's try see what happens. Again, I won't connect the whole thing just to check out what's going to happen here. So we got the first message. Hello, Chris. Congratulations on securing your Series A. Exciting times for in reality and the future sports training in VR. Would love to connect. So pretty good, pretty personalized. It didn't really relate it back to me or something, but it's also because it's very unrelated. Not bad, I would say. Let's see about the others. Hey, Aditya, I saw your post about shooting your podcast. Must have been a great experience as a fellow founder navigating the AI space. I'd love to connect. Pretty good. And then we have the third one. Hello, Bob. I saw your post about bringing RTX 509s to Salad for AI workloads. Very exciting. As someone passionate about AI advancements, I'd love to connect. Great. It's doing a pretty good job, I think. So I could add this one then as an example, as an extra example, because we give it more context on what output we want, right? So let's say it's pretty good. Now, what we can do, first of all, is, of course, maybe save this data, right, in a database or in a CRM. Now, let's say we're going to use just Google Sheets for now. So what I'll do is I'll first create a Google Sheets with all the data points we want to save. And we can just go like, okay, name, we want the name, we want the last name, we want the email, we want the LinkedIn profile, we want the company name, company URL, and maybe I think we also get the company LinkedIn URL. Now, of course, you can make this workflow much more complex, right? We can add lots more. We can personalize emails. We can personalize multiple messages. We can even start scraping the company data to become even more personalized, etc. But let's say now we do the LinkedIn outreach message. We add in the sheet 2. And we call it leads LinkedIn. Right now, if we go back to make.com, so we can just add in the Google Sheets here, and we can click add a row. Right now, my account's already connected, but if it isn't, you can just log into your Google account, right? And the nice thing is we already have your spreadsheets in your account automatically loaded here. So you can see we have leads LinkedIn here. And we're going to select the sheet name. Then you select if the table contains headers or not, and you can see the values are already automatically shown here. So now I can just map them. Now the name we already got from Apify, right? So we have first name, last name, right? Email, LinkedIn profile, Company name must get from LinkedIn too. Or do we get it? We get it from, okay, here from Amplify too. So we can add in here, in reality, name, company URL, also get here, and company LinkedIn URL, and we can add in the LinkedIn outreach message. And of course, you can add lots more data points because we also got a lot of new data points from these LinkedIn profiles. But just for the example, let's put it like this. Then we run it again. And if we go back to the sheets right now, you can see, right, we just get it filled out. Now, of course, you can get a lot more fancy here, right? We can do a lot more. We can extract a lot more data and enrich it in a database, but you get the idea. Now, of course, we can, to completely do the whole process, we would add in this, and of course, add in a delay here. You can see the schedule is automatically here, and now we can literally run this every day, for example, to scrape new leads and add them to Google Sheet. Now, you can actually send this LinkedIn outreach message directly to. You'd use a service that's called Unipal. Now, that will cost you, I think, maybe $40 a month. I don't have that account right now, so I can't show you. But here you can basically add in an API to send LinkedIn messages. So you could add that into your flow here and actually send out LinkedIn requests or messages. So that's it. I'll also make sure to share the template of this blueprint together with the resources of this video. Now let's go over the last part of this video, which are some more advanced skills and techniques you should probably learn in Make.com, especially if you start building out more automations. So let me go back to the presentation. So what I'm going to cover quickly are functions, right? Text functions, general functions, and some other functions and text parsers. Now, functions in Make.com are basically built-in ways to work with data or do something with data. And now the main use cases for these are usually either to filter some data, to transform data, for example, arrays, etc., to clean up data. For example, API calls usually don't accept, are not very flexible, right? So they don't accept special symbols, they don't accept new lines, special characters in letters, things like that. So a lot of times we have to clean up the data a bit before we can pass it on to the API call, and text functions can be very useful for this. We can also work with conditions in these functions, but let me show you very quickly. So I'm just going to add one here so we can show you. So I'll just put in the set variable. So here at the top, you can see on the left side, we always have access to our variables, right, from the previous modules. But here we have a few other options, and here we basically have our make.com functions, right? So here we have general functions, math functions, text and binary functions, date and time, and array functions. Now, in practice, you're mostly going to use really the text, sometimes general functions, and date, and maybe sometimes array. So let me go over the important ones very quickly. So how does this work? Let's just set an example variable name. So what we can do here is, if we select this, you can see that the explanation will be in the tooltip. But basically, we can just select this. And for example, this length one checks the length of a specific string, right? Or a variable. Of course, we can pass in a variable here too. So let's say we add in that variable results, right, to actually check, let's say that LinkedIn only accepts messages of maximum 300 characters. So for example, we can use this length to actually check how long this message is. And maybe we can then decide, based on if it's too long, we can put in a filter to actually not send it out to the API, for example, right, to avoid an error. Or we can reprocess it until we actually have less than 300 and then send it out. Right, so that could be, for example, a use case of this. So if I run this, of course, I have to define the variable because I don't want to run the whole flow again. So let's just say like, hi. Just as an example, you can see that we get back the amount of characters, right? And of course, now we get this in a variable, and then we can add in a filter, for example, right? So let's say we can add in a filter here with that condition, right? So that could be a use case. Now let me go over all of them very quickly. So let's say here in the text function, we have lower, which basically makes all uppercase or capitalized letters into lowercase. We have the other way around, right? Lowercase into capitalized, start case, etc. Replace, for example, we can replace a specific word inside of a string here. So let's say, hi, Ben. Here in the second one, we define the word we want to replace. right? And then here we can define the word we want to replace it for, right? So that's, as you can see, now it's hello Ben, right? Sometimes you might use this one, but let me go over the more practical ones. Trim, you might sometimes use, because again, like I said, API calls in request bodies don't accept lots of empty spaces or new lines, etc. And what trim does, as you can see, it removes space characters at the start or the end of a text, right? So let's say we have to pass on a clean text that has spaces before and at the end, and therefore our API call gives an error. We can just right. So let's say we have two spaces here. We just run this. Right now you can see we don't have any spaces. Right. So this trim function you might use sometimes. Then we have upper, which again makes all letters in uppercase. Substring you also might use sometimes, because sometimes API calls have limits of the amount of characters we can pass on through the API call. So let's say we are scraping a website and we get, I don't know, 20,000 characters back, but we can only pass in 5,000 characters into the API call. We don't really need the end of the text. Then we can use this substring, and here we can basically define, let's say, we do a very short one right now, but here we can define which of the characters we want to retrieve back. So we can basically limit it. Let's say we only want from 0 to the third character. Now in practice, you're probably going to use this more like 5,000, and pass in a variable here. But just as an example, you can see if I run this now, we only get the first 3 characters back, right? So substring you might use sometimes for those API calls. Then we have upper to string. This could be useful also. You can basically convert any other value to a string. So let's say you have a number function, but the next API call requires a text field with the number, and you can just convert that number into a string, right? Or even an array, or maybe a Boolean, right? So that's what this one does. Then we have maybe this one, the split, can be useful, right? With splits, we can create arrays from strings, basically. So what we can say is, like, let's say we have 3 websites we get back from an API call, but we want to process each website separately to scrape them, right? So we can go website 1, comma, website 2, comma, website 3, right? And here we define the symbol we want to separate it from, right? So if in this case we've separated it with comma, so we just type in the comma and it will know where to split the array from. So if I run this, you can see now we get an array here with the 3 websites, right? And then of course we could use an iterator, right, to loop over each of those separately to scrape them separately, right? So you might use that one sometimes. Then we have contains. Maybe you use contains. What it does is it verifies if a specific string actually contains a certain word, right? And it brings back a Boolean, right? True or false. So again, we can check if an email is actually valid by checking if it includes an @ sign, for example. And if not, we can get a false statement back, which we can then use as a condition, right? To not use the send email module, which will give us an error if we don't have a valid email. Right, so might use that one sometimes. Then we have general functions. Now, general functions, not very useful. This one, get, you might use sometimes. With get, you can basically get a specific value from an array. So let's say I have that example. I'm just going to add this here just so we can test this. We want to get one specific value from that array. For example, in that scrape LinkedIn, we only are interested in job title or a specific data point there. Then we can add this to get that specific data point. So set variable. So we go get. We add in the array, right? And we want a specific value, and we can just choose the one we want. So let's say we want the second one. If we run this, right, well, you can see we only get the second string back. Right, that's it for get. Then we have, let's see what else we have. Then we have if, where we can put in a simple condition, and if the condition is met, we can output one specific value, and if not, another specific value. So if you see the example there, if 1 is 1, it will output A, and if 1 is not 1, it will output B, right? And you can use these types of conditions here: is not, equal to, and, or, right? And we can also use these true or false here. Now, if empty, you might sometimes use, so if a string is empty, return this, right? Because again, sometimes if we send over empty strings over to an API call, it'll give us errors. So let's say a scraped website didn't work, then we can at least say not available or something like that. If let's say if a specific result, right, is empty, then output not available. Right, that's what it will do. Right, now, of course, again, we can use that as a condition. That's it really for the general functions. Then math functions speaks for itself. We can do simple math here, right? We could just use these plus or times, etc., and it will do math, right? We have some others, but I never really use it in practice. Then we have dates. Now, in dates, you do use it sometimes because, again, API calls sometimes ask for timestamps. So you can get a specific timestamp here, or you can get the specific date of the day, which is pretty useful sometimes. So if you click on now, you basically get the date of the day for right now, right? So as you can see, right, you get the date, right? And you can also then perform a function on it. Let's say, for example, I'm scheduling a task in my to-do list, and I want to have a due date in 3 days. Then I can make a function here where I add days to the date, right? So add days, we select the now, and then we just add 3, right? And now it's basically added 3 days to the today's date, right? So it can be very useful. And also make.com already has sort of the right format to pass into API calls normally. Now we can do some other things like format date to, for example, change the format date from European dates to US dates, things like this. Then we have array functions with array. What could be useful is the join array, right? So basically takes all the array data into a string, and that one can be useful. So for example, if we want to get this into a string, and we run this, right, you see we get it in a string instead of an array, right? So it could be useful. Then we have length, same thing, counts the amount of values in the array. We can use merge, right? That merges 2 or more arrays into one array. Contains, verifies if an array contains the value. Now map is one you actually sometimes use. So because basically what you can do with map is pick specific values inside of an array to only return back those, right? Because for example, in that LinkedIn data, we get lots of information that is not that useful for us. So we can then pick the specific ones right in there. As you can see here, you can pick all the specific values we want to bring back, and then it filters out that data basically. You have another one that you might sometimes use, which is flatten. And what flatten does, it basically, sometimes we have an array inside of an array, and what this module does is it simplifies it. So it takes that array inside of an array and puts it into one original array, right? So it sort of simplifies the data a bit. That's it, I think, really what you should know for functions. Now, again, you have to play around with this to get a feeling for this, but it definitely. But let's get to the last part of this video. I know it's been a very long one, but if you're still watching this, you've literally learned almost anything you need to know to build any automation on make.com. So the last one is text parsers, which we sometimes use. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the match elements, which we use regex for, or regular expression, right? The other text parsers, we've already seen a bit. I can show you very quickly. We do have some other text parsers beside that. So we have the HTML ones, right? I showed you the HTML to text, which in practice you're going to use most. By the way, there's also a function to convert HTML to text, which might be more efficient sometimes to use a function instead of this text parser module, because functions don't cost operations, right? While adding in a text parser, of course, will charge you another operation. But the one I'm going to talk about is the match pattern one. And the match pattern Basically what it does is it can help you match specific patterns over context or of a text, and it can help you with extracting data. It can help you identify specific text or strings inside of a larger context. It can replace, it can clean up text, or it can extract specific data like emails, numbers, dates, or any format you're looking for in a larger context. Now, it can be very useful when you have a specific sort of output you get from an API call, and you're always looking for a specific format or specific data point inside of that text. Now, with AI, it's become a lot easier for everyone to do this, actually, because we can just pass in text to an AI, instruct what to extract, and we have it as an output. But traditionally, regex and regular expressions were used a lot for this, and it is still a more efficient way to extract this, especially if we have a very consistent output from an API and we always have to extract a similar thing or similar data point from that text. Then we can use these match elements with regular expression to extract the data without using AI tokens, right? So of course it is going to be more efficient to use a text parser like this. So let me show you an example, because in the original automation of the competitor tracker, we used the text parser, right, with a match pattern, right? So as you can see here we have to add in the pattern, right, the regular expression. Now, again, I'm not a developer, so I have no idea how to actually do this, but the good thing is we now have AI to make these regular expressions for us, right? So, and here we just passed in the text. Now, in this case, from this RSS module, we got, let's give here, right, we got a URL back, right, with the new video, right? Now, to scrape the transcript, we can't pass in the API the entire link. We only want to pass in this video ID, which is this last part, right? And because every link is going to be similar, and we only want to extract this part, we can use a text parser for this, right? So we might even want to be able to use a function here where we basically replace this part or take out this part, right, and only have the last part. But in this case, we're using a text parser. So, and what you can see here at the end, we only get, right, that video ID, which we then pass into the API call here, right? So how does this work? How do we set this up? So again, best way is to do this simply with AI. So what we do is we just pass in, right, that URL to say ChatGPT. Now again, the reasoning models are usually the best at this, but you can just say something like, please write me a regular expression, which I'm going to use in make.com in the text parser match pattern. I need a regular expression that extracts only the video ID of a URL. All right, here's an example. And the video ID is, we add in that video ID. That's it. And you see, we just get the regular expression, right? Alternatively, you can also do this, but let's say we copy this. You can see it's actually different than the one we have here, but it should still work because there's multiple ways to write these patterns, right? So if we now click save and we run it again, all right, you can see that it did it correctly, right? And it does it for all the ones, right? So that's it. Can be pretty useful. And also to save costs on OpenAI or any other AI module, because of course you could do this by adding in an OpenAI module here and extracting the specific video URL. You can use this for other use cases too. For scraping is also a common use case. Also to clean up data, for example, what I said, these new lines, we can just instruct the model, instruct our GPT, take out, write a regular expression that takes out all special characters, all new lines, all white spaces, any accents, capital letters. We can say anything, and it will write us the regular expression, and then we can pass on that data, that scraped data, into the text parser, which will clean it up. Again, especially if we have, let's say a text with 10,000 characters. Of course, we can let AI do it, but it's going to be a lot more cost efficient if you let a text parser do it. So very useful to know. That's it for the entire make.com tutorial. If you're still with me, kudos to you, and thank you so much for sticking with me. If you like this video, I highly appreciate a like and a subscribe. And if you want to learn more about how to build AI automation systems, in our community. We have lots of templates available. We have an active community of people building businesses in the AI space. We're also doing co-build sessions for if you're a beginner, learning how to build these systems from scratch. So if you're interested in something like this and starting your own AI business, I would love to see you there. And thank you so much again, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.